Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Edelgard of the Rebellion in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 36, Truth or Consequences. It had been quite the eventful week for Edelgard von Hresvelg in her little rebellion. In the span of a week, she managed to get into a fight with the Death Knight and watch as her friend was cut down, narrowly avoided being blasted to smithereens by a weapon she didn't even know existed, raided a strange laboratory only to get thrown around like a ragdoll by a former noblewoman, and got ambushed in the abyss by the Ashen Demon. What she desperately wanted was peace and quiet. Maybe, if she hadn't been the Queen of Flames, she would have taken a nice vacation to Almira. No, that was enjoying herself at the cost of the subjugated Almiran people. Maybe the Nis would be nice. The perks of being a walking lab experiment included being able to shrug off any injuries short of being life-threatening, and so her sprained joints and a dozen lacerations across her body healed. Now they were simply a dull ache instead of back-breaking pain. But it also meant that every moment that she was healthy was an opportunity she could not waste. It also meant that she was imprisoned by her lack of injuries just as much as if she was bedridden. Absent-mindedly she thought to herself how her Black Eagles would react if she just up and vanished for a week. Surely they assumed that she had a life beyond organizing a rebellion against the largest empire that ever was. Surely they would understand. But unfortunately for her, mercenaries were a fickle bunch. She commanded their loyalty, but it was not an unbreakable bond. Edelgard had to be a leader, and leaders didn't take vacations. The closest thing she would get was taking some time to visit Ingrid in the hospital. But that in itself posed even more problems, especially when it came to Glenn. She did not know just how much he had told the magistrate about her escapades at Mara. All she could go on was his word and the fact that no enforcers had shown up at her door looking for Edelgard Eisner. That at least helped her sleep at night. Edelgard swayed to and fro in her seat on the maglev train, the leather irritating her barely healed skin. She had spent far too much time putting on makeup to hide some of her more recent bruises, and now she simply wore a modest black dress as Edelgard Eisner. After all, she wasn't simply going out for a night on the town, she was there to visit Ingrid. And, she thought numbly, the last time I dressed up, it only hindered my movement in her fight against the Death Knight. I can't afford that to happen again. Edelgard was acutely aware of the flat obsidian blades hidden in her heels in case of an incident. She could not be caught out like that again ever. Seeing that she was still on edge from the last few ambushes, Edelgard decided to pass the time by staring out of the train window at the scenery. The pressurized tubes meant that the entire system was closed off to the outside world, but the reinforced glass at least gave her a good view, even if it was like looking through a fishbowl. She passed a hydroponics facility where hundreds of trucks moved the food that would feed Newfoundland for perhaps a day, if not two. The ground of the planet was not exactly what one would call fertile, especially after the scars left by the Unification War. She barely could see the rows and rows of plants hidden beneath tinted glass, growing in water to both feed the populace and provide a source of nutrition for the Empire's artificial meat. This must have been Matthias District, the breadbasket of the planet. She supposed that taking it over would be at the top of her priority list. An army could not go without food, and starving out the Imperial legions was infinitely preferable to facing them in open combat. Edelgard would have to calculate the humanitarian risk, though she did not want to starve the planet for her sake. There were acceptable losses, and then there was the risk of being just as tyrannical as the God Emperor himself. She had seen the starving fields of her empire salted by the endless war. Farmers cheered her army as they passed and cursed her name in private, knowing that Emperor Edelgard was to blame for their failing harvests and lack of money. The only way she could sustain it was by slowly taking over the lands of Faergus, but their land was simply not as fertile. She was not blind to the suffering of her subjects, and it made her wonder if she was truly doing the right thing. How many would have to starve before her war ended? As the train continued at breakneck speeds, she watched as the scenery slowly began to shift away from agricultural facilities and barren fields back to a more familiar setting. Large plots of land gave way to more tightly packed townhouses, the roads teeming with people and vehicles of all shapes and sizes. Above their heads, several jets soared through the air, probably taking care of a high-priority cargo shipment. This was the line between Matthias and Fherdiad, and as she neared the center of the district she watched as the buildings began to grow taller and the lights began to shine more brightly. Out of the corner of her eye, Edelgard glimpsed the minimalistic symbol of an eagle traced in red spray paint across an abandoned building. Red dripped from its wings and beak, a warning to all those who passed. It was her symbol. The emblem of the Queen of Flames, and a sign that at least some of the people were with her. She guessed that it would be gone by morning. She had taken the train more times than she could count. But never had she felt the gravity of the world that she held in her hands, knowing what her rebellion could do if she was not careful. The blazes of an uprising could burn away the corruption of the magistrate and lead to a better world, but it could also burn down what was left of humanity in the process. She watched as Fhirdiad burned before her army. Never before in history had a city been sacked by its own defenders, as the Immaculate One soared above the skies and razed all who dared to approach. The acrid scent of burning flesh seared her nostrils, and she resisted the urge to vomit. The screams did not stop ringing through her ears as flocks of people fled towards her army, searching desperately for refuge among the burning hell that was once their city. Hovercraft soared in the skies as the buildings became taller, moving in perfect lines of traffic as if they were birds and not some of the most expensive aircraft in the empire. Massive projected advertisements for various products shone with bright glowing light, enticing people to throw their money away for the sake of pleasure and vanity. The train shot by several highways and the elevated walkway that ran through the heart of the city. Edelgard watched the flow of people as they flitted about, with never any time to stop and appreciate the world around them. Either they were glued to their holodecks, or hurrying to wherever they needed to go. She supposed that had it not been for her circumstances of birth, she, too, might have been confined to the vapid life of trying to climb the corporate ladder. There was a noble sentiment in trying to make a better life for oneself and their families, but it was also meaningless at the same time. Those who lived in Fhirdiad had the means to live, but it would never be enough. They wanted a new apartment, or a fancy new car, or this time a vacation to the Nis. Yet in an attempt to live a better life they forgot to live in the process. The average masses of New Fodlan were content with their lives. They saw the Queen of Flames as nothing but an agitator, causing a disturbance in the so-called utopia that the God Emperor had granted them so freely. He enticed them with the tantalizing bait of wealth and opportunity, yet few ever managed to climb high enough to be colloquially considered a noble. They believed that they had agency in their lives, when in reality their world was completely shaped and controlled by the magistrate. In order to succeed, she would have to shake the common people out of their apathy. The poor had reason to rally with her. The rich had reason to fear her. But the middle class? Edelgard would have to pull the wool from over their eyes and reveal the truth of the empire, and present an alternative infinitely preferable to the God Emperor. A revolution without a leader was a mob. But a revolution without the people was simply terrorism, and a queen without an army would be put to the guillotine. "I'm here to see Ingrid," Edelgard stated plainly. "Ingrid Brandy Galatea." "Name?" the receptionist asked without even looking up. "Edelgard Eisner." The receptionist looked up at the woman leaning over the front desk, then back down at her hollow screen. "You're on the list. Room 501C, up 3 flights and down the hallway. Can't miss it." She gave a quick thank you and took her leave. Fhirdiad Memorial Hospital was massive, the size of a moderate apartment complex reaching for the stars. It was also one of the most expensive, with state-of-the-art amenities and a team of doctors who worked around the clock. Unlike the smaller trauma hospitals, it was meant for long-term stays and esoteric surgeries. Ingrid had been moved here after her initial surgery, hopefully because things were turning out for the better. It was the best care money could buy, and since the Frildariuses were rich beyond belief, they could afford it. As the pristine white floors and decorated hallways showed, money could buy a better quality of life. Edelgard wondered just how many of Mercedes's clinics she could open with the money spent on the main lobby alone. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward room 501C, unsure of what to expect. On the off chance Glenn had sold her out to the magistrate, she reasoned she might be able to fight her way out and disappear into the abyss. Surely they hadn't made the connection between her and the Queen of Flames, though escaping would probably spell it out for them. There was also the chance that she would merely be an afterthought, another onlooker in the crowd of friends and family gathered around Ingrid. Edelgard was just a friend from college, she barely mattered in the grand scheme of things. The third scenario that she feared most was that she would have to speak to Ingrid alone. The thought made her palms sweaty, and she hoped it wouldn't have to come to that. Edelgard had failed her utterly. It was her fault that she was like this. If she had just fought a little better, been a little more prepared. With shaking hands, she pressed a palm to the door and watched as it slid open to reveal a very surprised Ingrid, surrounded by a couple of people sitting by her side. "Edelgard," she shouted from her bed, making an effort to rise from her bed before wincing. "Ow!" Ingrid Brandel Galatea was laying down in her hospital bed, clad in a blue hospital gown that was draped across her broken figure. Her light blonde hair had been cut short, going down to about her shoulders, and was now splayed across the bed frame. Parts of her head were still bandaged, but she noted that there seemed to be bits and pieces of metal poking out from where her hips were. A brace, perhaps? "Hey, Ingrid," she greeted softly. "Oh, this is your other college friend, right?" a ginger-haired girl asked. She was short, with her hair neatly tied up in braids and a cheery smile that stretched ear to ear. The shade of her hair was rather familiar. Who in her life had she seen it with that color? Other. "Dorothea just left," Ingrid said morosely. A twinge of guilt settled in her heart. She had been texting Dorothea empty platitudes about how she was all right, and that once Ingrid got better she was happy to take them out to dinner, but it was a meaningless farce. She wondered if the idol had been avoiding Edelgard on purpose, or if it had been a cruel twist of fate for them to barely miss each other. Looking at Edelgard's horrified expression, she quickly softened. No, she's not avoiding you," Ingrid explained as if reading her mind. "Dorothea just has a shoot right after this. She said to tell you to make dinner plans for this week. Non-negotiable." "I was hoping to wait until you left the hospital," Edelgard replied sheepishly. "Then we could all eat together. Just like old times." "Well, you don't have to wait for me. I don't know how long I'll be here, and at this rate it might be a while." Ingrid looked downwards at the lower half of her body with a somber expression. She noticed that her hand was still tucked neatly underneath the covers, and Edelgard wondered sadly if it had been reattached properly. Glancing at the two people next to her, Edelgard barely acknowledged the presence of another person next to the ginger. Ingrid must have remembered that Edelgard had no idea who these people were. In any case, she contributed, "This is Annette Fantine Dominic." Annette, Edelgard. Dominic. She struggled to remember who in her life had been a Dominic, before settling on the fact that she was simply a very cheery noble. The shade of hair was very familiar, though that much she remembered. "Hi," she chirped. "Nice to meet you, Edelgard." The girl's smile was infectious, and she found herself smiling in response. "The feeling is mutual, Annette." "And this is Felix," the girl named Annette said. She pushed a purple-haired man in front of her, who yelped and cursed at her half-heartedly. If she hadn't known any better, she would have assumed that it was Glenn. But his build was slightly leaner, and his hair was slightly longer. Unlike his counterpart, he wore a permanent scowl on his face. Edelgard raised an eyebrow. "You're not Glenn." The man raised his hands in exasperation. "Why does everyone say that?" "You really do look like him," teased Annette. "No, I do not." "You do," said Edelgard and Ingrid in unison. She glared at Ingrid, which prompted a slight chuckle out of her friend. "Felix here is my fiancé's little brother," she shrugged. "Felix, Edelgard." "Edelgard, Felix." "So I've heard. Ingrid says you were quite skilled with an axe when you were at Newfoundland Uni," he said with a smug grin. "Care for a duel when you're free?" "Felix," Annette warned. "You can't just ask random girls to duel. It's rude." "Why not? It's the best way to train." "Don't listen to him," she muttered, shaking her head in disapproval. "Ever since Felix got to nationals for dueling, he's been going nuts about studying the blade and getting stronger. Sometimes I wonder if he even remembers that he's dating a human and not a sword." "TCH, he scoffed at his girlfriend. At least my sword doesn't sing songs about beasties. Felix." She yanked his ear, pulling him backwards as he squirmed. She heard him mutter something about the sword not being as cute before their conversation descended into a meaningless squabble. Edelgard decided that they were a strange couple, but she had certainly seen stranger relationships in her time alive. "Well, anyway," Ingrid said, ignoring the lovers' quarrel before her. "How have you been?" she asked. There was a hint of awkwardness between them. "Actually, it was more than a hint and was now veering into uncomfortably awkward territory. The last time she had seen Ingrid, she was soaked in her own blood and clutching onto the severed stump of her wrist. Edelgard had been covered in the Death Knight's blood, red searing through her vision as she plunged her fists into his mangled face. It was a far cry from the hospital they were now in, and she really didn't know what to say. What had she been doing the last week? It certainly was a long week. Suddenly she was reminded that Edelgard Eisner had technically been sitting at home moping for the last week. She had told Dorothea as much, which was a complete lie considering she hadn't even been in her Inver villa for the last few days. Bored, she lied. Haven't really been doing much. We both know that's a lie, Ingrid replied dryly. Have you at least been having fun? No, Edelgard said quietly. Not really. And I thought I was doing badly, Ingrid muttered. Here I am, with one foot in the grave, and you're the one moping around. You really shouldn't joke about things like that. Really? Last time I checked, she said bitterly, joking is only thing that keeps me sane here. Ingrid lifted up her right hand from underneath her covers, and Edelgard gasped in horror. From the wrist upwards was a shiny chrome mechanical hand. Wires and small actuators were exposed, whirring and extending as she flexed her fingers one by one. Skin met metal in a perfect seal, as small metal implants dug into what was left of her wrist. It was horrifying in more ways than one, and she could hear the blood roaring in her own ears. Your fault. You did this to Ingrid. She whispered in horror. I'm so sorry. Don't apologize, Ingrid scoffed. If anyone should be sorry, it should be Dash. Her words caught in her throat, and Edelgard gave her a worried look. Ingrid glanced at Annette and Felix, who were still arguing about something involving beasties in the background. They seemed to be caught in their own little world, but Ingrid somehow managed to pull them out of their little spat. They quickly caught on at the fact that she was giving them a death stare, and sheepishly moved away from one another to give Ingrid their attention. Can I talk to Edelgard? Alone. Ingrid's expression was pained, and it was clear that she wanted to have a one-on-one with Edelgard. She knew that Ingrid did not only have Dorothea and her as friends, so it only made sense that there were a lot of visitors. But it felt strange to see her with other people, and it made Edelgard feel like an invader in the life of Ingrid Brandel Galatea. You don't have to tell me twice, Felix muttered darkly. What did he mean by that? Okay. Annette said without missing a beat. We'll be right outside. Right, Felix. He nodded in response, and the two quickly took their leave as the door shut behind them. Interesting friends you got there, Edelgard remarked dryly. Ingrid breathed a deep sigh of relief. They're not exactly the most traditional of couples. Well, at least Sylvain's out there to keep them company. Oh? Sylvain's here. If I didn't know you better, I'd say you were hoping that he wasn't. I find his antics amusing, Edelgard said with a small smile. He still asks me to dinner every other time I see him, you know. Only every other time? You're losing your charm, Edelgard. I seem to recall all those guys and gals lined up in college, waiting for a chance to score with the Ice Queen. I was not an Ice Queen. And Dorothea isn't an idol, Ingrid retorted. No point denying it. Edelgard blushed, feeling her cheeks burn. Anyway, she said, returning to her somber mood. What were you going to say? The Death Knight. He deserves worse, Ingrid said, her eyes darkening. Worse than what? I heard about you taking him down after he chopped off my hand. Edelgard winced at how nonchalantly she mentioned that part. Glenn told me the magistrate took him afterwards. The whole thing's been pretty hush-hush for now. I heard all the other witnesses were forced into silence. Ugh, Edelgard said, taking a seat on one of the chairs facing Ingrid. I thought the whole thing would show up on the evening news by now. And now they're keeping it quiet. Oh, it is. The Mara Massacre, they're calling it. Just no mention of the Death Knight. Any clue why that could be? Ingrid pondered the question for a moment. I think the authorities want to sweep it under the rug. Whatever the Death Knight is, they don't want people finding out, which is why they took him. And there's the fact that Glenn altered the report. He did what? Edelgard shouted. Not so loud, Ingrid winced. He was covering for you. Edelgard was taken aback by that. An enforcer, covering for her of all people? Never mind the fact that it was her best friend's fiancé, he was putting his neck out on the line for someone who he had only met a few weeks ago. I suppose it was a thank you of some sorts for saving my life, Ingrid explained. He told me that you were experimented on and that you didn't want any attention drawn to your strange strength. So he left out a few details. I guess I'll have to thank Glenn next time I see him. Did you see the report, though? She asked. She had to at least try to ask, right? Oh, it was the usual magistrate bullshit. Those guards at Mara are getting posthumous civilian awards for their supposed conduct. And isn't it funny how the security footage magically disappeared and that the witnesses won't testify? There's no way Glenn would do that, Edelgard muttered in disbelief. No, he wouldn't. But you can go ask the Ashen Demon for them. The thought of the Ashen Demon knowing the truth chilled her to the bone. But they seemed to have an agenda of their own based on their fight in Abyss. It was clear that the Ashen Demon was not playing by the magistrate's rules. She was safe from the magistrate for now. But not from the Ashen Demon. I always found it funny how you always won those arm wrestling contests in college, Ingrid said wistfully. Now I know why, and I don't feel any better knowing that it was against your will. I should have told you, Edelgard said quietly. Sooner. I know you wouldn't, Edelgard. You like to keep your secrets close to your chest. And besides, Ingrid added, now I feel bad for all those times I pushed for you to go to nationals. Edelgard Eisner had been the top of her category in the university dueling circuit. But she had never actually gone past that level, electing instead to stay whenever her team went on to compete nationally. She usually just waved it off as disinterest in competing at a higher level, but the truth was that she felt guilty. She had always been good with the axe, but knowing that many of her victories could be attributed to factors besides skill rubbed her the wrong way. Her boorish strength could be used for many things, but fame as a dueling champion was not something that appealed to her. Ingrid, on the other hand, had qualified for the Solar Games purely on skill alone, a fact that was not lost on either of them. Dueling was more of a hobby for me than anything, Edelgard admitted. Which also wasn't a completely true statement, because it served more as an outlet for her to train and vent her anger at the world harmlessly. It was no coincidence that the more she operated as the Queen of Flames, the less she appeared at practices. There was always a cost for her double life, and so the talent for dueling she had nurtured since she was a young girl became merely a tool for her ambitions. I wish I could say it was just a hobby for me. The doctors say that I might never regain the dexterity I once had in my hand, not to mention the spinal injuries that I suffered. Ingrid shook her head. You think they'll let me compete in the paraplegic games? Ingrid, Edelgard said sternly. Stop. The future can wait, there's no point worrying about it now. She reached out and took Ingrid's right hand in what was meant to be a comforting gesture. But she felt the cold touch of iron as she pressed her fingertips to it, and she suppressed the urge to flinch. You should focus on recovering, and take things one day at a time. I can't just sit here and wait forever. I want you to, Edelgard thought bitterly. I want you and your family to stay out of my way so that they don't get caught in the crossfire. But just because Glenn was doing her a favor didn't mean that he was absolved of all guilt. And she did not know if either the Frildariuses or the Galates were as corrupt as the rest of Newfoundland, and Edelgard knew that she might not like the truth if she dug deep enough. Instead, Edelgard gave a more non-committal answer. You don't have to, she suggested with a weak smile. Maybe you could pick up a different hobby in the meantime. You have something in mind, then? Painting. Ingrid gave her friend a pointed look. Are you serious, Lazygard? Yes. It's good for the mind. Edelgard, I'd like to remind you that I have never managed to make a work of art that wasn't complete and utter garbage. Well, then, now's the time to start practicing. She tried her best to smile and lighten the mood, but Ingrid was having none of it. Well, it seems that your advice has gotten worse, Ingrid muttered, but it was through a wry smile. Maybe I could try gardening. Don't you live in a penthouse? Glenn takes care of the plants in the foyer, she explained. Even 1,000 feet in the air, there's still room for green to grow. She was about to comment on how Glenn somehow seemed to do everything around the house and then stopped herself. I think that's a wonderful idea, Ingrid. Maybe I'll gift you a cactus so you can't kill it this time. Ingrid chuckled. Life finds a way. Or death, in this case. She sighed, letting out some pent-up frustration that had been building up for a while. I'll have to ask my fiancé about soil types and watering cycles. Fun. Speaking of which, Edelgard said, eager to change the topic, where is Glenn? He was the one who called me here, after all. Oh, you know, he's just doing search and rescue at Mount Gaspard. Really nasty business, from what I've been hearing. Then her voice dropped to a whisper. Glenn's been having nightmares. He hasn't said why, but I can only guess it's because of that. Oh. That's where he was. The ramifications of Lonato's last stand were still unfurling, and with it came the sheer amount of damage that the mountain's partial collapse had done to Gaspard district. Not only had the mountain been partially leveled based on her intel, but the ensuing landslides had destroyed quite a few buildings in the process. There were probably only a few survivors, and if they were having enforcers do search and rescue, it meant that the 12th Legion was practically decimated. There were always consequences to her actions. Innocence would always be caught in the crossfire, no matter how much she tried to minimize casualties. But she also didn't need to. The Queen of Flames again, huh? Yeah. Ingrid wrinkled her nose at that. Seems like the world is going to hell in a handbasket rather quickly. A rebellion, a masked knight running around, it's like we're in the pages of a novel. Well, at least we're not the ones that have to deal with it, Edelgard said with as much of a straight face as she could muster. Let the magistrate handle it. We don't have to worry. But Glenn does. I'm worried about him, Ingrid whispered. What if he gets hurt or worse? It's a risk being an enforcer these days, Edelgard reassured her, but even so he's a captain, and with a famed legacy at that. They're not just going to throw him out onto the front lines. He'll be all right. I'm sure of it. Was she? She was, after all, responsible for the deaths of so many enforcers by her own two hands. What if Glenn stood between her and her goals? Could she do what was necessary, or would she spare his life for the sake of Ingrid? Maybe. But I'm also worried that I'll be a burden to him in the most important time of his career, maybe his life. This couldn't come at a worse time. If Glenn's as good of a guy as you think he is, then he won't care, Edelgard replied without missing a beat. Love is meant to last through sickness and health, and if it doesn't, then it just wasn't meant to be. The guy is head over heels for you, you'd be crazy not to see that. So just trust in him, Ingrid. Ingrid just stared at her for a second. I don't know if I should be taking romantic advice from you of all people. But thank you, Edelgard. It feels good to hear that from another person. Edelgard turned red. From me? What could you possibly mean by that? Well. After being thoroughly humbled by her good friend, Edelgard and Ingrid left each other with a tearful hug and a promise to visit more often. Admittedly, she wasn't planning on leaving until sundown, but Ingrid requested some personal space for a bit, which she granted. Ingrid would hopefully be out of there in a week or so, but her injuries would remain for a lifetime. She would most likely be spending her time in and out of the hospital, returning for physical therapy and to monitor both her mechanical hand and the neural implant that bypassed her spinal cord. The Death Knight had apparently shattered several vertebrae and damaged her nervous system irreparably, but thanks to modern science, she was able to walk again with a series of artificial implants. What her body could not do naturally, it could do with the help of technology, and it was the best that money could buy. But she would never duel again like she used to. In a real battle, cybernetics were meant to give an edge and could mean the difference between life or death. However, it dulled the reflexes, and the sensation of fighting and dueling just wasn't the same with artificial limbs and implants. She knew that Ingrid might never adjust to feeling the world through cold titanium fingers, and it might be years before she regained her physical capabilities from before her injury. There was no choice for her but to wait it out, a prospect that terrified her friend. All Edelgard could do was be there for her when she needed it. She walked into the lounge to see if Felix and Annette were still there, and sure enough, they were. Felix was sitting in a chair, leaned all the way forward as he stared at the projected screen, while Annette had her head buried in a magazine. Accompanying them was a familiar scarlet-haired man, with a wide grin and a flirty demeanor, though this time he didn't have the luxury of being able to flirt with everyone he saw. Normally she would simply dismiss his presence as annoying, but there was a nagging in the back of her mind that screamed danger. And when Sylvain José Gautier turned around, she understood why. Staring back at her was the same hair and eyes that Miquelon, the Scarlet Scourge, had. The face was completely different. Miquelon's had been slightly wider, covered in a network of ugly scars that only accentuated the rugged look. But the sneer that crept into Sylvain's facial expressions was the exact same. Miquelon was a Gautier? A binding wave of nausea told her that she was right. Once Sylvain saw her, whatever grimace that had been on his face vanished and morphed into the cheery smile of a flirty playboy. "Hey, Edelgard. How was the girl talk?" Just looking at him was enough to make her reel a little, though now it was due to her own confusion instead of wanton disgust for his antics. But she managed to keep it together, and steadied herself by plopping onto one of the couches in the lounge. "Just fine, Sylvain. Nothing for you to worry about. But I like juicy gossip. Come on. Someone as cute as you has to have some interesting stories." His face was in a mock pout, and she repressed the urge to break his nose. "Please." "Oh, would you stop with the groveling?" Edelgard said dismissively. "It's a bad look on you." "Really?" His ears perked up at that. "So that means I look good every other time." "Quit flirting, Gautier," shouted Felix from the other couch. She looked to see that he was watching the results of a fencing match on the lounge television intently, his eyes tracing the movements of their swords as they danced. "You're interrupting Khrushchevsky v. Oaks. I have no idea what that means." "Annette, do you know what that means?" The girl in question peeked out from beneath a science magazine and glared at Sylvain. "No. I don't really care." "Shouldn't you care about your boyfriend's interests?" "Fencing is like the only thing I don't care about when it comes to Feely." "Don't call me that," Felix muttered, his eyes still transfixed to the screen. Edelgard's eyes narrowed, seeing the cover of the magazine, or more accurately the scientific journal. On it were the latest discoveries in biochemistry, most notably the science behind blood reconstruction and nonite cancer treatment. But what stood out was that it was the same journal that Mercedes had read for years. "Is that Scientifica Faudlani?" she asked carefully. Annette put down the journal for a moment and looked up at the strange woman asking her a question about what she was reading. She probably didn't get very many of those. "Yep," she chirped, still as bashful as ever. "I'm a biochemist. I make it my job to keep up to date on all of the latest scientific news." "Oh? I would have guessed that you're still in school at the very least." She turned red and her hands ran through her hair as a nervous tick. "Well, technically I am in grad school, but since the doc in charge leaves me with all the work I might as well be a biochemist already." Huh. She thought for a moment, and then remembered that Mercedes had a friend who also happened to be a biochemist. Who also happened to have the surname Dominic. She mentally slapped herself for not realizing earlier. The mental fog in her brain was making it harder for her to form connections and recall past tidbits. And it certainly didn't help that the more memories surfaced from her past life, the more she was unable to tell fact from fiction. Edelgard knew the girl looked familiar, but she risked being sucked into her memories if she tried to recall any more. "Are you also studying biochemistry?" Annette asked. "Or are you just interested in these kinds of things?" "I have a friend who reads this stuff." "Honestly," Edelgard admitted, "you could explain anything in that book for a year and I still wouldn't get it. I leave the science stuff to her." "Oh, it's Merci, isn't it?" "What?" "Mercedes." Edelgard blinked twice as if she was surprised. How did she figure it out so quickly? Had Mercedes told someone? "Merci knows everyone," Annette said plainly. "She's the reason why Felix and I met in the first place." "Really?" "Yep." "Felix, want to elaborate?" No, he didn't even bother to look at her, still glued to the riveting match. She winced as Khrushchevsky delivered what would be a otherwise fatal blow had they not been using plastic swords, earning him the crucial point. "Boys and their sports," she muttered, rolling her eyes. Edelgard could only give her a weak look of pity before Sylvain began to interject. "You know, Ingrid really appreciates you being here." "Really?" Edelgard blinked twice. Excuse me. What was so bad about what I said? She paused, taken aback at the strangeness of Sylvain Gautier. No. I was just surprised. You don't seem like the sentimental type. That's because you see my sly and handsome side most of the time. But I can be vulnerable as the most delicate flower blooming in the sunlight. Sylvain, you had a good thing going there for a moment, she said, and then laughed hollowly. You kind of derailed it with the last part. But I mean it. He put up his hands in an earnest gesture. Before you came, it was so awkward. She was happy to see us, of course, but she just kept quiet most of the time and fiddled with her hand. Even Dorothea couldn't crack her shell. But somehow you could. I guess I just talked to her, Edelgard said quietly. I didn't do anything other than be there for her. That's really all she needs, Felix pointed out. The match had finally ended, and now he gave the conversation his full attention even if it wasn't much. My brother can't be at the hospital all the time. So it's our duty to keep her company. What about her family? Edelgard asked innocently. She swallowed her words as she received several heated glares from Sylvain and Felix. You know what I mean. The Galatea side of the family. Don't they come visit? She doesn't talk to her father. Oh. That explained quite a lot. One father is enough, said Felix bitterly. Especially when you have one as overbearing as mine. He was, of course, referring to the Frildarius patriarch. It only made sense that the father-in-law picked up the slack when Ingrid's own father could not, and regardless of whatever had happened between father and daughter, she at least would not be alone. At least your father isn't an asshole, Sylvain quipped. When I was a kid, he wouldn't even bother to visit. At least Mr. Galatea sent a text. Boys, stop, Annette declared. She then turned to Edelgard, who was feeling more and more of an outsider in their conversation. You should join us for dinner when Ingrid leaves the hospital. That'd be a good way to show our thanks. Right, Felix. She nudged him to make sure he was paying attention. That is a good idea, he mused. And we can spar beforehand. Felix. It's fine, said Edelgard dismissively. I'm a bit rusty, she lied, but it'll do. I'll ask Dorothea as well, Sylvain said. She might not like it if you ask, Edelgard warned. Now, it's fine. My charm will win her over. That prompted an eye roll from all three of them. Then it's settled. Dinner when Ingrid gets out. But for now, why don't we head back into Ingrid's room and see if she wants to play a game? Annette suggested. Sure. Any game suggestions? Edelgard asked. Poker, she said without skipping a beat. Edelgard didn't mind that at all. Everyone have some credits on hand? Felix asked. Yes, Edelgard replied blithely. Are we betting? Of course. You all are about to get completely cleaned out, just warning you beforehand. Yeah. Sylvain smirked at his friend. Not if I have anything to say about it. She would have to tell Ingrid that her other friends were definitely far weirder than Edelgard or Dorothea. But no matter who they were or what they looked like, they remained there for Ingrid's sake, and so Edelgard resolved to play the part of a caring friend as well. If she could not be a good person as Edelgard von Hresvelg, at least she could be a good friend as Edelgard Eisner. That was the least she could do for Ingrid, and though she could not undo the dreadful night at Mara, she could at least make up for it in small gestures as a way to assuage the aching guilt in her heart. 300 civilians dead from the landslide alone, Glenn muttered. A legion, slaughtered by a single blast. By the goddess. The bodies were piling up faster than he could count. Usually the robots would pick up signs of life in the rubble, but beneath Mount Gaspard there was nothing but corpses. The blast had annihilated everything on the surface, leaving a glassy surface that covered scattered chunks of dirt and steel from the destroyed buildings. Lonato's foot soldiers and the men of the 12th Legion were dug up one by one, their bodies taken away either to be given a proper burial or thrown into a mass grave. And those were the lucky ones. Some had been vaporized entirely, leaving only bits and pieces of flesh and metal behind. Whatever blast had hit the mountain had utterly destroyed it. Geological scans denoted that much of the mine remained intact, but it didn't do much for the structures that spanned the mountainside. The ensuing landslide had destroyed a sizable chunk of Gaspard district, leaving a wake of destruction that spanned miles. Those who were not directly hit had to be treated for injuries related to shattered glass and ruptured eardrums, and then there were those who desperately searched for their loved ones in the rubble. Glenn turned them all away with a promise that the magistrate would find them, and when he closed his eyes he could hear the wail of widows and children as he was forced to have them identify what was left of their beloved. Mount Gaspard could be described as more of a crater than an actual mountain. The mountainside was more gray and black than anything, as the once grassy slopes now looked closer to the surface of the moon than the countryside. The detonation itself had caused a structural collapse in the mountainside, and released a shockwave equivalent to a magnitude 7 earthquake localized in the area. Whatever weapon had caused this was staggering in power, and they were lucky that the impact had been restricted to a relatively unpopulated area. The official story was that Lonato had detonated a warhead of some kind in a suicide attack, once he realized he could not hold his position. But the blast pattern and the radius of effect simply did not match up with what the media reported. The lack of radiation aside from low levels of gamma meant that it could not be an atomic, and a bunker buster would have created more of a fireball. And the field reports suggested that he had been winning until the explosion. Or what was left of the field reports, most of them had been covered in black ink. Redacted. 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 At some point he realized he was essentially filling in the blanks for a report that was too censored to be useful, which he threw into the shredder in a rage. From his field desk he sorted through a pile of paperwork, pertaining to names of the deceased, compensations to be paid out to their families, and various insurance reports to be filed for the buildings destroyed. He had been searching with the rest of his men for any signs of life, until Commissioner von Aegir himself ordered him to take a break and go back on desk duty. What he did not tell his boss was that the searching helped. It helped keep his mind off of the fact that his fiancée was still in the hospital, and there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. But he only traded one tragedy for another, and now he was stuck to clean up after a mess that appeared never-ending. "Sir." One of his lieutenants ran into the room, Robert Dries, as evidenced by his bushy eyebrows and his jovial attitude. But even his happy-go-lucky subordinate had been taken down a notch by the sheer loss of life, and his face was covered in soot and grime. "I have the reports you asked for, about the eyewitness accounts of the explosion. You'll want to hear about this." "Okay," he said, trying to keep his tone calm. "Give a quick summary." "It's not just one explosion. All of the witnesses said that they saw 2 explosions. The first one was small, but the second one was a blue beam from the sky that blew up the mountain." Then he put his hand on his chin, thinking the whole situation over. "But that doesn't make sense, Captain," he added. "What doesn't make sense?" "The second explosion, or the part where it came down from the sky?" "Yes," he replied dryly, before returning back to form. "The classified reports I managed to get my hands on all said the same thing. The same story of a laser blast from the skies, all ending with a massive shockwave." Dries was right. That did make no sense. How would Lonato get access to an orbital strike weapon, if they had been developed long after he retired? And the Queen of Flames wouldn't have access either, considering she was nothing more than a mere mercenary. The security on those weapons was airtight, and though it was mostly classified far beyond his station, he knew that there was no way the magistrate's super weapons could be hacked. A chill ran through his bones as he came to a realization. There had to be only one explanation. The God Emperor had fired on his own soldiers. Though it might have not been his hand that pulled the trigger personally, the fact of the matter remained. In order to destroy Governor Lonato and the Queen of Flames, he had ordered a strike on his own legion. Perhaps it was a shrewd move, a gambit meant to wipe out any opposition to his rule. But the cost was far too high. The fact that the commissioner had been nervous in his last status meeting suggested as much. He had mostly been left to fend for himself, with no intelligence reports coming from his superiors. Now he knew why. Glenn's eyes narrowed. Who else knows about this? Whoever wrote the reports. And there had to be at least 1,000 witnesses to the whole thing. But nobody has actually gone forward with the story, and all the footage of the incident has mysteriously disappeared. Is it because it's classified? He asked with a hint of obliviousness. Maybe the commissioner wants to keep a lid on the story for now. Shit, he muttered under his breath. He was already too late. No, It's not just that, Glenn said, shaking his head. You are to tell no one. And hand over all documents relating to the supposed orbital strike, if that's even what it is. But sir, Lieutenant Dries said. Shouldn't people know what happened at Mount Gaspard? Or at least relay the eyewitness accounts to the media. Until I receive word to do otherwise from my superiors, I order you to remain silent. Lieutenant, if the reports are true, then we are dealing with something far greater than a mere rebellion. If you don't mind me asking, sir, what is it? The less questions you ask, the better. I'll have to investigate the matter myself. But that's an order. Am I making myself clear? He paused for a second, swallowing his words. Then the lieutenant remembered his place, and bowed. I understand, sir. He moved towards the door coldly, but Glenn motioned for him to hold for a second. You're a good kid, Lieutenant. It's not that I can't trust you, but that I'd rather you not get involved until I can assure your safety. But mark my words, I will get to the bottom of this and you'll be the first to know when I do. Until then, continue as you were. Thank you, Captain Frildarius. He nervously tapped a rhythm with his left combat boot, but his tone had softened. I know you're just looking out for me. I'll return to my patrol as is, then. Lips zipped. Do that. Good luck, Lieutenant. He waved him off and returned to sifting through the various paper and holographic documents on his desk. Lieutenant Dries mustered a salute in deference to his direct superior, and then marched toward the door and into the night. It left him with nothing but eerie silence as he pondered the situation alone. Surely he couldn't have been the only one to come to the same conclusion. The evidence was there. This was a cover-up by the higher-ups which had been happening quite a lot lately. And though he was only an enforcer captain, as heir to House Frildarius he was privy to a lot of information far beyond his station. There would have to be a clandestine investigation of what exactly had happened. Perhaps he would have to consult his father. Why lie about the explosion? He wondered what the ramifications would be if it came out that the Empire had fired on its own soldiers. Some would cheer their sacrifice, while others would condemn the loss of life and the collateral damage. But the most pressing question was, why fire the weapon at all? Surely if the Empire was so great, then a single legion would be enough to capture the Queen of Flames and the once Governor Lonato? These were questions that shook his faith in the Empire. Once upon a time he sought the position of Enforcer Commissioner, and it was that assumption that led the current Commissioner to personally oversee him. Would he get the answers to his questions then? For now, all he could do was bide his time. He had no intention of turning traitor against the Empire. He trusted his men far too much to do that. But Glenn Frildarius had every intention of finding the truth merely because it was the right thing to do. There had to be a good reason for firing an orbital weapon here, and the answer would determine how much he could trust in both his position and his superiors. Ingrid would agree, even if she knew the dangers that came with delving too deep into the secrets of the Empire. But he couldn't let her get caught up in this. Not after what had happened. He would die before he let someone hurt her again. The Ashen Demon appearing. The Death Knight massacring a nightclub. Ingrid suffering a hand and spinal injury. Her mysterious friend, whose experiments granted her super strength. A queen emerging from the flames of New Fodlan. A super weapon fired upon the very people it was meant to protect. The world was collapsing before him, and all he could do was watch. Goddess, grant me the strength to see this through and the wisdom to do the right thing, he prayed. But the goddess was not listening, and so he had no choice but to continue on alone. It was not long before Captain Frildarius drifted off into a hopeful daydream about growing old with his wife by his side, blissfully unaware of the true depth of the magistrate's secrets. Chapter 37, Past and Future Present. It is now 12 in the afternoon. Rise and shine, Miss Eisner. The robotic voice chirped in her ear annoyingly as she laid face down on her mattress. Edelgard was tired. She had been for quite a while and she wanted to enjoy her sleep for as long as possible. But as she felt the light seep in through her eyelids from the sun, she knew that she did not have the luxury to sleep any longer. Just give me a minute, she murmured to no one in particular. The thumping headache she nursed was probably due to her rude awakening, but she could also blame the half-emptied bottle of cheap vodka sitting on her nightstand. Edelgard had picked up many things from her biological father, and a prodigious appetite for alcohol had been one of them. The dreams stopped when she drank the only solace she could find from the never-ending nightmares and memories that haunted her nights. She had forgotten how quiet her home was. Back at the Black Eagles' hideout, she had grown accustomed to the constant hustle and bustle of men and women moving about. But there was complete silence save for the whirring of her incessant robo-butler and its emotionless voice. She had half a mind to rip its head off and reduce it to scrap, but Edelgard had begrudgingly grown accustomed to hearing it greet her. Having another presence in the house, even if it wasn't human, was necessary in order to keep her sane. A feeling of loneliness washed through her as she continued to lie down, and the space on her queen-sized bed next to her remained empty. It was a painful reminder that Edelgard von Hresvelg was so very much alone, both in soul and in body. "My professor, my beloved. You have 3 things on your to-do list, Miss Eisner." "What is it?" she moaned, her voice muffled from being buried in her pillow. "First up, you have a meeting with Linhard." She bit back a curse. Edelgard swore that she would never show up on time again for one of their meetings again, or she would be waiting in the lobby for hours. But he was a vital part of her operations due to both his connections and his technological know-how, and she would have to play along with his quirks in order to remain in his good graces. Second, you have a strategy meeting with Mr. Molinaro. That was fine, she could simply push it to later and discuss what to do with the Black Eagles. With the casualties incurred by the disastrous incident a few days ago, she would now have to begin taking on auxiliary members. It was necessary to expand their ranks after all. A rebellion could not consist of 40 people alone. But it was not something she was looking forward to doing. It meant a complete restructuring of her mercenaries and, of course, more money being taken out of the Hresvelg inheritance. And last but not least, you have dinner with Ms. Arnold. She flipped over and threw away the covers, realizing that she could not in fact lounge around lazily for the rest of the day. Of all the things on her to-do list, that made her the most nervous. Edelgard was unsure of why exactly. Before she made herself presentable for the day, she glanced at herself in a nightgown before her full-body mirror. The trip to Mount Gaspard hadn't exactly been a vacation, as she now bore a new set of scars that she would have to figure out a way to cover up. And though her muscles remained as toned as usual, there was a chronic soreness that wouldn't quite go away. She had to be careful about how she continued to fight. Her recklessness was proving to be more of a burden than anything. Edelgard sighed as she raised her hand only to watch the woman in the mirror follow suit. The toll her double life enacted upon her was both physical and mental. She wondered whether or not she would finally find the limits of her augmentations, and if there would come a day where she would be nothing but a withered husk of a woman. And that was only if she lived to see that day. The life of a mercenary tended to be quite brutish and short. No. She was not just a mercenary anymore. She was a queen of a rebellion, and she had to carry herself as such. Even if it meant bearing more scars upon her body in order to save her men, putting more lives on her conscience, or committing an evil to destroy an even greater evil, it was all necessary for the future. One day at a time. That was the only way the Queen of Flames could take things, because if she did not, then she would descend into madness. "I've developed the perfect solution to your little tensor problem. I have the odd feeling," Edelgard said with apprehension, "that I won't like it." "In a way, yes." Linhard's lab was even more messy than usual. She could hardly call it a lab, and instead more of a loose assortment of projects, various metal pieces and wires thrown haphazardly across the room. Massive machinery surrounded his work table, which included various fabricators and mills that would never be seen on the consumer market. She supposed that it was a perk of being the heir to a massive tech conglomerate. He got to play with all of his father's toys. What drew her attention today was her armor, lying on the table in pieces. It was the lightweight one, meant for recon and moving quickly when needed. The synthetic mesh and the metal plates that protected her vital organs were now separated, as she watched the man go to work with a tool that looked suspiciously like a soldering iron. He yawned. "I still have no idea how it works." "How what works?" "The Novelli girl's telekinetic gloves." "Tensors, whatever. The point is, it's almost like magic." "I don't believe in magic," Edelgard said firmly. "Of course you don't. But I, on the other hand, tend to keep an open mind when it comes to these things. Linhard turned off the iron and flipped up his face mask to reveal his pale visage. He still looked as youthful as ever and his complexion was that of a ghost. She supposed it was due to the fact that he was about as much of a hermit as Bernadetta was, and so his skin remained untainted by sunlight. It seems to be some kind of gravity manipulation. She clucked in disapproval. Even I knew that. No, no. You see, we've had gravity tech for a few decades now. Being able to bend one of the fundamental forces of nature to your will is quite the useful tool for air transport. But usually they tend to only reduce its effect. Miss Novelli, on the other hand, has developed quite the tool. Seems less like a tool and more like a weapon to me. Her head still smarted from the thrashing that Constance had given her and her eye twitched involuntarily. It was the first time that Edelgard had encountered someone that she couldn't merely smash her way through. When it came to the Ashen Demon or Thunder Catherine, she could fight just like she was trained to. But Constance von Novelli? She could make Edelgard dance like a puppet if she wanted to. But think of the applications this could have. Linhard seemed positively giddy, and if she didn't know any better she might even say that he was excited. With some field testing, we could easily have this thing in production for industrial use. How would you have it in production if you don't even know how it works? Well, I'm not a physicist, so I don't really understand the finer details. He slouched into his working chair, which was singed black in quite a few places. What I do understand is the technology part of it. Linhard, she warned. He held up his hands in defeat. I know. Get to the point. Are all you Hresvelgs so bossy? She would have killed anyone else for even bringing up her family's name, but with Linhard, Edelgard was at a loss. He really didn't mean his insults at all, they were just matter-of-fact statements. What irked her was that he failed to recognize the gravity of certain situations, and also the meaning of respect. Perhaps Waldemar did nearly disown his son like the rumors said. But as long as he kept his mouth shut about her identity both as Edelgard von Hresvelg and the Queen of Flames, he was all right in her book. So she kept her axe sheathed in her own mouth shut, and let him ramble on. Anyway, the gloves themselves use a tracking mechanism to manipulate the position of attracted items. And you mentioned that she uses neural enhancements to make the calculations for how much force to apply. That's what the other scientist said, she replied, recalling the enigmatic Happy's words. Sounds like an awful lot of work to do all that on the fly, he said. So, I figure that if we stop her from doing that, then she can't throw you around. Edelgard frowned. How do you plan on doing that? It's simple. The technology is an unknown variable, but the woman is a known one. We confuse her. Linhard pulled up a diagram of her armor on the hollow screen, with one notable addition. Embedded in the center of her chest was some sort of device, circular in shape and embedded around her heart. Normally it was where her heavy armor's power source was located, but seeing that it was her lighter armor she was surprised to see anything at all in the chest area. This is a vibrator. Excuse me? Edelgard questioned indignantly. Now that was something she hadn't expected Linhard to say today. He gave her a confused look as if to ask why she was so upset, and then shook his head. Of course. He was like a toddler when it came to these things. Well, more accurately, it's the same type of vibration-inducing mechanism used in a vibroblade. Set the vibrator to the right frequency, and even the dullest of blades can cut through the thickest of armor. She felt her face grow red with second-hand embarrassment and buried her face in her hands. For the love of the goddess, can we call it something else? Don't know why you're so upset about it being called a vibrator. Fine. We'll use the technical term vibration-inducing mechanism. Whatever. Doesn't change the fact that there's one that's going to be embedded in your armor. So you want me to turn into a human vibroblade? Not exactly, Linhard said, and she mentally prepared herself for his explanation. If you were to strap a device like that to a human and run it at the frequencies needed to cut through steel, you'd be spending magnitudes of energy only to vaporize your own organs. No, a far better idea would be to use a variable frequency, randomly pulsing at millisecond intervals to create the effect of a vibration. I get the idea, Edelgard stated, but what does that have to do with Constance? I'm hypothesizing that her tensors track her targets based on her brain's perception of people, and that the calculations only work on a target with a stationary center of mass. But pulsing the human body at a frequency high enough to disrupt her concentration, and with an intensity low enough not to turn your organs into bits and pieces, that would do. I see, she said, cupping her cheek in thought. So you want to confuse her, instead of trying to counter the tensors themselves. Exactly. I'm so glad you understand. He clapped his hands in mock applause. But what makes you think that some vibrations will actually throw her off? For all we know, she could be some kind of savant who accounts for these things. It was a valid worry. Happy had said that her counterpart was enhanced. Just a working hypothesis, Linhard replied, deflated. But since the woman's not here to test our theory, you'll have to test it out in the field. Have I failed you yet? She thought of the first iteration of the grappling hook that Linhard had built for her. Edelgard at first was going to just buy one, but he insisted on making one for her to her exact specifications. It ended up dislocating her shoulder and almost getting her killed on the trial run. I'm not answering that. Okay, fine. But it's the best chance we have at neutralizing the Novelli girl. He shook his head. Still doesn't answer the question of why Constance is down there. After the Dodden-Brigid War, she explained, the Novelli family was left in shambles. Her investigation into the former House of Novelli revealed a staggering amount of corruption and the fact that their assets were almost entirely in their partnership with the Brigid royal family. She had the benefit of hindsight to say that it was certainly a mistake, considering it did not save them from the rebellion that tore the planet apart. House Novelli fell to the revolts, and there were not enough of them left for the emperor to save. And so Constance fell in between the cracks, and ended up working for the magistrate. Edelgard was acutely aware that she was neglecting quite a few details, but she decided that Linhard really didn't need to know about everything else. I see, he said, eyes still glued to the hollow screen as he made a few adjustments to the schematic of her armor. It's a bit of a shame she's not as obnoxious as she used to be. In her mind's eye she could picture the image of a blonde teenager in a blue and white dress, fanning herself constantly in some sort of exaggerated pose. The haughty voice of the Novelli girl could be heard from anywhere at any of the social functions that the nobles of Newfoundland attended. But she never paid any attention at all to the table of brats that were set to inherit most of Newfoundland's wealth, and she felt a bit of regret in doing so. If Edelgard knew that she would be running a rebellion 12 or so years down the line, she would have cozied up to all of them so that she could use their influence later on in the future. Von Aegir, Burgleys, Novelli, Heavering, the list went on and on. She could have bent the ears of some of the most powerful heirs of Newfoundland and maybe even swayed them to her side. But for now she had Caspar, Linhard, and Bernadetta, and that wasn't a bad thing at all. And the time she spent with her little brother at those parties instead was more than enough. She would have traded all the power and wealth in the world to have him by her side once more. I didn't really know her, she admitted. Linhard yawned lazily. Yeah, well, neither did I suppose. I never did like those stuffy parties. You don't have to tell me twice. Her eyes moved to the schematic once more. Is the vibrating mechanism comfortable to use? I don't like the idea of jittering during my spelunking. It should be barely perceptible, since we're running it at a high frequency but low intensity. Want to test it now? He grabbed a small circular device and offered it in an outstretched hand to Edelgard. She graciously accepted with her own hand and slapped it onto her chest, letting the locking mechanism grab her dress to secure itself. Turn it on. He gave her a pointed look. You asked for this, he shrugged. With a flourish of her hand, he activated the device. For a moment, the world began to buzz. She felt her body vibrating, just barely but enough to know that it was working. When she raised her hand she could see it quivering as she steadied herself so that she would not fall. But after a few moments she barely even registered that it was there, and relaxed as she adjusted her stance once more. Not bad, Edelgard admitted. Still, will this fool her? One can only hope. He powered off the device, and Edelgard was finally able to relax. How many can you make? She asked. Want a dozen? I'll take it. Sold, then. You have what I asked for, right? Combat footage of the Ashen Demon. Edelgard asked, rifling through one of the pockets sewn on the inside of her dress. Her fingers curled over a small chip that she promptly pulled out and offered to him. Yes. He grabbed it greedily and slapped it into a small chip reader. Instantly the footage of her dueling the Ashen Demon popped up, and she winced as she watched herself take a blow that would have been fatal to any other person. She could only trace the motion of the Ashen Demon's purple blade flashing in arcs as it illuminated the shaky video, clashing with her own red axe as Edelgard struggled to keep up. There was a brutal efficiency to their strikes, and a gap in skill that could not be surpassed with training alone. I see, Linhard murmured. I'd like to get my hands on that sword. Perhaps developing a counter to the energy blade would be a fruitful endeavor. That's all? Edelgard thought. He hadn't even asked about why the Queen of Flames was fighting the Ashen Demon, nor did he question the latter's existence at all. All he did was nod and murmur at the footage. It vexed her to no end that he knew her true identity, yet barely even acknowledged it. It was hidden underneath their mock charade of spelunking and skydiving, despite Linhard von Hevering knowing exactly who and what he was supplying with weapons and armor. But she also was quite grateful, because it was one less loose mouth she would have to silence for her cause. The energy blade, Edelgard muttered. She watched the expert dexterity of a trained assassin in full display before her, cutting in wide arcs and precise stabs. I'm more worried about the hand behind it. For that, I have a few EMPs that are being shipped to your distribution center. But I like to develop things myself, so I'll see what I can do about countering the solidification principle. The what? She asked. The energy blade solidifies around a field of energy. Disrupt the field, he explained, and the integrity of the weapon begins to fail. Lovely. Just make sure it works, she warned, and she really meant it this time. Yeah, he said dismissively. I'll figure it out. She watched as he pulled up a series of technical documents that was far above her pay grade, rifling through them with gestures as he searched for whatever it was he was trying to find. Still, she pondered the question of the Ashen Demon. Edelgard wanted so desperately to neutralize them to find out what was beneath the mask and what made them tick. She could not place the feeling that drew her to the enigmatic killer, and she had so many questions that were left unanswered. For the first time in a while she felt as if she could not simply kill her way out of her current situation. It had worked before, but the situation with the demon was far too delicate for that. The fact that she was relying on Linhard so much left a bitter taste in his mouth. He was a genius by any standards, and if he actually had any ambition in his life, he might have brought Hevering Industries to a level that surpassed even the Magistrate's research division. But instead, he merely frolicked around and indulged himself in random projects. Edelgard had the sneaking suspicion that Linhard only put up with her because he found her antics amusing, along with the research data she supplied. He did not care for her motives, just a promise that she would come back with more data. Perhaps it was for the better, since it meant that his projects were devoid of emotion and built purely from logic. She certainly could not complain about his work. But despite his ingenuity and technological wizardry, there was a certain element left unaccounted for, the human element. Technology alone could not save her rebellion. It was her and her Black Eagles that would bring change to the world. Fancy gadgets and weapons were nothing but parlor tricks in the grand scheme of things. Still, with human and machinery working in tandem, there was a far greater chance of success than with either one alone. The tools that she was provided so graciously by the Hevering boy would be put to good use, and perhaps it would prove the difference between life and death. Edelgard would soon put it to the test in rescuing Constance von Novelli, and perhaps in her next duel with the Ashen Demon. The link is secure. Yes, my lady, did his gruff voice responded over the line. Good. Edelgard laid out the documents on her desk at home that Didier had sent her. It was a long list of various case files and dossiers on prospective members, who had either expressed interest or were flagged for possible blackmail or persuasion. She did not have the time to sort through all of them personally, but it was useful as leader of the Black Eagles to at least get a sense of what she was working with. Have you read through the files, then? Not all of them, she admitted. That is fine, he rumbled. It will be our job to look them over and send you the list for approval anyway. I have faith in you and the rest of my lieutenants, Edelgard replied simply. That being said, are there certain criteria you are considering? He cleared his throat, as he prepared to lay out his plan for recruitment in detail. The Black Eagles cannot function by relying on combat alone. There are those with combat experience who I hope to fast-track into our ranks. But the bulk of our recruitment will be in the civilian sector. Her analyses of previous rebellions against the God Emperor suggested a staggering amount of incompetency and corruption. The magistrate might have been corrupt, but the various rebel groups and splinter factions were just as bad. There were those who clung to their vain preconceptions of power and wealth, bitter about how much the empire had taken from them. And there were those who were desperate to improve their own station in life, so desperate that they would sell their soul to live comfortably. These were easy targets for corruption and sedition within the ranks of a rebel army, and something that she would have to deal with. Thus the vetting process was more important than ever. Wars were won through intelligence, not necessarily through the bravery of soldiers. It was important for Edelgard to get a read on the general environment that she was fighting in, and if she could be kept privy to the magistrate's movements, then she would have the advantage. There was only so much that the Queen of Flames could do against an ambush or an army. The better option was to avoid a losing fight before it even began. That was why it was so important to solidify her intelligence network, and why Yuri was so valuable to her cause. I see, she surmised. So I assume that we have collaborators in various industries that are willing to provide us with the necessary information. I have already made efforts to reach out, Dida replied. Good, then. I'd like a report on weapons manufacturing and transport within the next few weeks. Should help with gauging the strength of the next force we encounter. Dutton will be very helpful, he agreed. It was a shame he was caught so brazenly with his mistress in public. Thus, he will have incentive to be honest to us. Or else, Dida repeated, knowing fully well what Edelgard did to those who did not comply. What about the spies we have currently embedded? Edelgard pulled up a few more documents and began to read off of it, her face now shrouded in blue and red light from the screen. Well, our little Burgleys is still firmly entrenched inside the magistrate's intelligence division. It will take time for her to crack the encryption, but when it is done we will have a trove of intelligence to sort through. She is far too young to be in such danger, he noted. Should we be concerned? Flesh can handle herself, she said, though it was mostly to convince herself. The girl reminded her a little too much of herself when she was younger, and she really would have preferred if she lived beyond her little mission. But there was always the chance that she would be captured, and so Edelgard had already made the necessary arrangements to deal with her if need be. One could never be too careful when in close proximity to a Vestra. Then she shall remain there for the time being, Dida declared. Has our partnership with the Mockingbird proved fruitful? His network is focusing on locating the various labs that pop up from time to time across Newfoundland, Edelgard explained. With any luck, we should locate one within the next few weeks just based on transport convoys. I would like nothing better than to burn all of them to the ground, Dida said, as she could see his eyes flare with anger even through the hollow screen. Master Bladdid will be avenged, even if the cost is my life. She bristled slightly at that statement, knowing full well that Dida was just as vengeful as she was. We cannot let our anger cloud our vengeance, Edelgard warned. Dimitri would not want us to rush in blindly. You of all people should be angry, he replied. You were there, and his tone went soft, when I could not be. Images of broken bodies and the concrete walls slick with blood flashed through her head. She remembered watching the last bits of her extended family go under the knife and return as another statistic, another Hresvelg lost to the sands of time. She remembered Dimitri. No, she warned herself. You can't remember. She couldn't afford to remember, or she would be lost to her own pain. It was for this reason that she drank. While she was not on the Blade Breaker's level when it came to leaving bar tabs across the city, Edelgard von Hresvelg's vice was a nice bottle of brandy or vodka that she could use to dull her senses. It was the only way that she could manage her emotions, and sleep at night before she was plagued with false memories. In a way, the glimpses into a past that never was helped, every strange dream meant one less nightmare that would leave her broken and crying in the bare night. Within seconds, however, she managed to keep control of her emotions in front of Didu. She had to remind herself that he had lost just as much as she had, if not more. It was better for the both of them to have someone to confide in, and she was thankful that at least one person from her life as a Hresvelg/Bladdid could be there for her. But out of stubborn pride she also refused to lean on him too much, or she would be nothing more than a burden. "I know," Edelgard said wistfully, studying Did's weary face through the screen. "But I also understand that there is information we need from those labs. Perhaps a weapon we can use in our fight, intelligence. Or," she continued as she swallowed heavily, "the truth behind the tragedy of Dusker. You would be hard-pressed to find that." Did's eyes turned stony for a moment. "I have searched through thick and thin to find any information relating to my people, and yet it seems like nothing more than a land grab. Your people," he added, "always saw us as beneath them. Primitive. Only Lambert saw us as equals, and perhaps it was why they killed him. An adequate explanation if we were in medieval times," she surmised. "But with the Empire, there is always something else at hand. Perhaps the real reason has to do with us." She didn't need to elaborate on what us meant. She was referring to the Hresvelg children who had been experimented on one by one. For some reason she felt as if she remembered 10 siblings and not 10 cousins, but she chalked it up to the chaotic jumble that was her mind at the moment. In the end, they were nothing but distant relatives. Only Dmitri really mattered, even if they were not related by blood. Dmitri was simply there because he, too, was a Hresvelg by his father's marriage, but perhaps that was what they wanted. Perhaps they wanted him specifically, but she could not know for sure. There are certain noble families that have specific genetic markers that make them more receptive to experimentation. Happy had said that back underneath Mount Gaspard. What could she have meant by that? Dida fell silent as he contemplated his words. Her eyes naturally dropped to her desk, not wanting to make eye contact as he continued to remain stony-faced. He had always been a man of little words, and after the destruction of his home world it seemed that he had retreated further into his own mind. With nothing else to do, she began to glance through some of the dossiers that her lieutenant had given her. The first few were simple mercenaries, whose loyalty could simply be bought. But one in particular caught her eye because she was not a mercenary, and thus she pulled the file up to the front and began reading aloud. "Ladislava Zavatsky," she read, and instantly a pang of familiarity clutched at her heart. For her undying loyalty to the Emperor and her valiance proven through battle, on this day Ladislava Zavatsky shall be granted the title of General in the Imperial Army, and shall henceforth be given command of the 6th Legion of the Imperial Army. By the order of the 23rd Emperor of the Adrestian Empire, Edelgard von Hresvelg. She studied the features of the woman carefully. Neatly tied light brown hair framed her stern expression, with piercing red eyes that could instill fear in even the most hardened of soldiers. It was exactly as she remembered Ladislava, except for the fact that Edelgard had never met the woman in the first place. "Ah, the Major," Dida replied. "A standout candidate by any means, save for her ties to the Empire." Edelgard continued to read. Born to an unremarkable family in Minas, so a commoner. Attended military school, rose through the ranks all the way to Major, a litany of awards that came from the Almiran War. On paper it looked good. Few in the Black Eagles had formal military training, and extra leadership certainly never hurt. But the lack of motive for her supposed rebellion concerned Edelgard, and the fact that Ladislava was retired despite her meteoric rise in status as a female officer suggested that something was off. "Did you scout her as a potential candidate?" Edelgard asked. "No. We caught her asking around in Abyss," Didu answered cryptically. She tapped her desk with her red nails, thinking about the possibilities. A falling out with the Empire, perhaps. Or she might not be able to find employment despite her service history. Or, Didu proposed, she could be the worst spy in the history of espionage. Edelgard raised an eyebrow at that. "You can't be serious." "I am. Why would a retired major take up spying? And if they really were trying to infiltrate the Black Eagles, would they not be more subtle about it?" She knew the magistrate's handiwork, and this was more clumsy than anything. It seemed that Ladislava had her heart in the right place, but her naivete of the underworld meant that she was unable to do anything unless Edelgard personally vouched for her. "I cannot take risks when it comes to the sanctity of this organization," Didu affirmed. "I appreciate the sentiment. But it's not necessary when we can instead begin to compartmentalize information amongst the Black Eagles." "Ah," and a look of understanding crossed her lieutenant's face. I suppose it is unnecessary to keep all of the men in the loop. The hand knows not what the other hand holds, she replied somberly. Those who fight for us will have to be vetted properly. But the bankers, electricians, merchants, even our informants? They only need to know what is necessary for them to operate. Perhaps a restructuring will need to be in order. I'd like some plans drawn up with the input of Bernadetta and some of the other lieutenants. Delegation is necessary, Edelgard said with a sigh. I can't be everywhere at once, it seems. I am happy that you are taking the time to rest, Didu agreed. You are the backbone of our cause. It lives and dies with your well-being. If we are to succeed, then the Black Eagles must be able to produce results without me. She gently massaged her palms together, struggling to find the right words. I won't be here forever. I know that. You know that. The thought of her own death did not frighten her. She would be happy to plunge into the abyss, to be free of the suffering in her own mind and return to the family she held so dear. But the only thing staying her own hand was the fact that her work would be left unfinished. She would vanish from the world, without so much as even leaving a mark besides the epithet of the Queen of Flames. Edelgard von Hresvelg wanted a better world, and she could not do so if she was dead. That was what drove her to continue her fight, and no matter how much her body and soul remained tortured, her will would remain unbroken. As I pledged to serve Master Blad did, so, too, have I pledged to serve you. On the honor of the Sky King, I would die for you with no regrets. Didu, Edelgard said, her tone softening. I would want nothing more for you to live. She tried not to think about the fact that she had handed him over to the magistrate, before she had discerned his true identity. It was a mistake she hoped to rectify. I live to serve. No, she replied quietly. Not anymore. You should live to make the world a better place. He stood there silently, his face remaining still. Then after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. I see. Perhaps I can do both, Didu said. By serving you I serve your cause. And it is a noble cause. Your stepfather would be proud of the woman you have become. She gave a solemn nod in response. There was nothing she could say to Didu, the only remaining relic of the lost life of a spoiled noble girl. It would have been nice if he could have moved on, like Hubert had ostensibly done. But despite her initial misgivings about having someone who served her rather than worked with her, she could not ask for a better ally than the steward of her deceased brother. Now, back to business, Edelgard declared, shaking all thoughts of her past out of the head. Have we set a date for the raid on the weapons depot? Tonight. Tonight, she shouted in surprise. She must have heard wrong. That was far too early for something that had just been planned a few hours ago. It is the best moment from a tactical standpoint, based on the security schedule we obtained. But she cringed, trying to think about how to explain that her dinner date with Dorothea couldn't be postponed again. But there were always trade-offs when it came to her double life, and so she supposed that she would have to simply bear it on the chin and let Didu handle it this time. If you have other responsibilities, then I will handle the raid accordingly. Put your faith in us, Didu said, just as we have all put our faith in you. He looked behind his shoulders for a brief second, and then turned to face her. Edelgard. You do not need to shoulder the weight of the world alone. She sighed, one of deep loneliness and regret. But she could not help but agree. Fine, Edelgard acquiesced. What do you have in mind, then? I was just thinking, Dorothea said. About the future, you know. They were dining in one of the nicest steakhouses in Newfoundland. Normally she would have balked at the exorbitant price tag, but it turned out that Dorothea Arnold had once performed an event there, and thus was entitled to whatever she wanted off the menu at a generous discount. Every few minutes she glanced at the beautiful view that was revealed by the ceiling-high windows. Outside, the rest of Mach shone brightly, and despite the darkness it seemed as if Newfoundland remained just as lively as it was during the day. Men in suits and beautiful women were scattered all around the restaurant, and it was clear to anyone that she was surrounded by Newfoundland's wealthiest nobles. Their table for two was no different. Dorothea was in a less than modest violet dress, though the colors were muted enough to not scream pop diva. As usual, she looked about as perfect as ever, and her beautiful green eyes and plunging neckline was enough to make even Edelgard blush a little. She felt downright ordinary in comparison. You're set for life, aren't you? Or have you blown through all that money on fancy cars and drugs? Edelgard teased. Dorothea smiled a bit, but there was a bit of regret behind the curl of her bright red lips. I haven't really had anything to spend it on. You could write a song about that, you know. The curse of stardom, or something. The words admittedly sounded better in her head. I don't think anyone would believe me. What, that you don't like being famous? That I'm responsible with my money? She paused for a moment, knowing full well that the heartthrob of the empire lived in a modest apartment and ate salads half the time despite her success. But Dorothea had to keep an image, and so her wardrobe and skin were immaculate in spite of her otherwise frugal life. The life of a celebrity was surface level, indeed. Edelgard let out a snort. That's a good point. Dorothea gingerly picked at her steak, and Edelgard noticed that she was quite a bit more nervous than usual. I was talking about this with Manuela. About the future. She cut off a piece of her own steak and waited for Dorothea's reply as she chewed. Or about your financial habits. Both. There's gonna be a day when no one listens to my music anymore, and I'm back to being a normal girl who dared to dream. I'd like that, she said wistfully, but at the same time I can't help but love the limelight. What about taking a break, she suggested. You know, a vacation. Go explore the system. Do a few concerts. Have some fun. Maybe with you and Ingrid, she said. But. Edelgard looked downwards at her steak. Yeah. I know. But she'll be all right. There's a lot of good people around her. And she has us, too. Am I doing enough? You've done plenty, Edelgard reassured her, taking her hand for a second. I don't think your fans or your agency could blame you if you took a break. I know I'll miss that feeling of having the crowd cheer my name, Dorothea said, and then paused. Goddess, I guess I am addicted to the limelight. For some reason Edelgard thought of the smug satisfaction on her face when the Queen of Flames made her first broadcast to the world. She knew at that moment that the entire solar system was watching her, and there was nothing they could do about it. Now they all would know her name for better or for worse. Perhaps she, too, craved the attention of the world, except her friend was a diva and she was a terrorist. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I just don't want you to burn out, Edelgard said. I like fun, Dorothea. Said Dorothea makes me sad too. It'll be a few years before I burn out like Manuela. Maybe, Edelgard suggested, you can run a line of clothing like she did. Or do what Rosette did, and switch to acting full-time. That's, actually not a bad idea. Dorothea was smiling now, and Edelgard was at least glad to have said one thing right tonight. I can go back to theater, before I got wrapped up in all of this diva nonsense. It'd be a fun retirement, I guess. Retirement, huh? Only if I live that long, Dorothea quipped. And what about you, Edie? Her emerald gaze pierced through her own eyes, down to her very soul. What plans do you have? Truthfully, I don't know, she lied. I haven't really put much thought into my own future. Well, I know that other than your investments you don't really do much these days. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about what you wanted to do in 10 years. 10 years. 10 years was a long time. She had been operating as the Queen of Flames for nearly 4 years, and yet Edelgard was already beginning to feel the toll of combat. Her augmentations shielded her from any wear and tear that most mercenaries had, but the mental cost was beginning to be a bit much for her to bear. In 10 years, she might be still fighting a hopeless battle against the magistrate. Or she could be dead. Either one was not a prospect she wanted to entertain. Would she still be talking to Dorothea in 10 years? Would she even be remembered? Edelgard shook her head. I like living in the present far too much to think about that. Edie, you have to have a dream, right? Edelgard stared at her friend. What? Everyone has a dream. I wanted to become famous, Dorothea said bitterly, and now I am. What's yours? She hesitated for a moment. I want to make the world a better place. It's a bit vague, Dorothea replied, but that's not bad. Like activism. You could say that. I think there's plenty of things wrong with the world as is, she said. Then she looked over her shoulder to see if anyone was listening in. Though there isn't much you can do about it without pissing off the powers that be. Tell me about it, Edelgard snorted. She sipped more on her glass of wine and continued to think. It irritated her how resistant the world was to change. Despite the chaos she and her Black Eagles had caused, it seemed the world continued to turn regardless. It was one thing to start a rebellion, but another to keep it going. She would have to do something drastic and soon. I hate not being able to do anything without them finding out. One of many reasons why I sit on my ass and don't do anything, Edelgard lied. That's probably better than getting caught up in that Black Eagle's nonsense, Dorothea sighed. I get why, but I can't agree with hurting people to make a point. I think the ends justify the means to some extent. Dorothea snorted. Sure sounds like something you would say. I mean it, Edelgard said sheepishly. Gradual change isn't going to work. I think they go overboard sometimes and I don't agree with everything they do, but it is representative of a larger problem. Like poverty, class divides, all that jazz. Sure. The people aren't happy. And if they don't feel heard, well, I can't really be surprised when they make people listen. You sound like a Black Eagle. Edelgard shrugged. I'm not trying to get arrested. Just pointing something out, that's all. Well, if you do, let me know, Dorothea grinned. I'll be happy to write a song about my feathery friend. She laughed in an automatic response, though it was devoid of mirth. Something in Dorothea's dress buzzed, and she began to turn pale. Whatever it was, it couldn't have been good news. She quickly moved her chair out from beneath the table and rose, her eyes flitting back and forth to find a place where she would be uninterrupted. Give me a second, she said, and began taking a call from her holodeck. Edelgard watched the fading form of her friend as she vanished into the night. Dorothea was a handful, but she also served as Edelgard's conscience by proxy. It was good to hear the honest truth sometimes and also keep her from being too disconnected from reality. It also didn't hurt that she was absolutely gorgeous and her presence was enough to brighten anyone's day. Fate had a funny way of bringing people together. Even if it was something as mundane as being college roommates. She glanced sideways to see if anybody was listening in, and then dialed Yuri's number. Queen, he said, though it was quiet enough that no microphone could pick it up unless it was right next to her ear. Yuri. Have you assembled a team? I have. Does tomorrow work for you? At the rise of dawn. If that's what you want, he said, yawning. I'll catch up on sleep before then. Why? It's not like you're going. The silence on the line was deafening. You're going, then. I have to. His voice was grim and determined. I can't let them suffer any longer. Okay. Give me the details later, then. She couldn't be reasonably sure that her communications were safe here, so it was better to err on the side of caution than risk it. Are you calling me from a restaurant? Yuri asked. Edelgard turned red, and she was thankful that the video wasn't on. Maybe. Well, enjoy your dinner date, if that's what it is. I'll see you in the morning. Understood. She clicked the line off only to find Dorothea back in her seat, staring at her in confusion. Business call, she asked. Edelgard flagged down a waiter and asked for the check, which was promptly denied as the waiter pointed to Dorothea. She had no idea what that meant, but unfortunately her plans of paying for both of them were stymied before they even began. Yeah, you could say that. Edie, about what you wanted to tell me in the hospital. What? Don't tell me you forgot. Her expression was hurt, and Edelgard felt a bit of guilt for keeping her in the dark. But it had to be done for now. About the whole truth? I haven't forgot, but... Truthfully she wished that Dorothea would forget, that she could simply ignore what had happened in Mara. But Edelgard knew that she would pry, and she worried for her friend if she began to pry too much. I get it, Edie. I think some things need time, she said. Take as much as you need. I want to tell you, but it's just that. Just what? Maybe not in the middle of the steakhouse. Next time. Does that mean I can come over to drink? Dorothea asked sweetly. Edelgard laughed. Maybe. but come by whenever you want, as long as you call ahead. Of course. I have a collab tonight, so I'm probably going to leave from here, Dorothea explained. I'm sorry we can't go out tonight. I was going to sleep early anyway, Edelgard lied. But have fun. And thanks for grabbing food with me. Anytime, Edie. She got up to give her friend a hug, wrapping Edelgard in a crushing embrace as she put her arms around her friend in return. She wished she could stay in that moment forever, before Dorothea pulled away and gave her a kiss on the cheek. She felt the touch of lips upon her cheek, warm upon her icy exterior. But it wasn't the same. Stay safe, all right, she said, her eyes filled with concern. Perhaps there was something else beneath that gaze, but for now it was of no particular concern. Edelgard's face was practically beet red. She stuttered over her words before she recovered her composure and cleared her throat. Who are you talking to? She said, recovering her composure. I'll be fine. For some reason there were butterflies swimming in her stomach as she watched her friend walk away. Normally she would have left the restaurant with Dorothea, but she needed a moment alone to reflect. The last bit of wine in her glass disappeared down her throat in a single nervous gulp. You have to choose, Edelgard. Your friends, or your family. Your fragile life, or your tragic past. The choice would come sooner or later. It was only a matter of whether or not she was ready to make said choice. Chapter 38, Delving Deeper. I've given them the data you sent over to me. The mission parameters. Edelgard asked. Yes, along with the information you collected about the laboratory, Yuri explained dryly. I don't trust them, she muttered, her voice echoing out from underneath the one-way glass that hid her face. Mercenaries can never be trusted. Now that's downright insulting, he said in a mocking tone. I didn't trust you when you first waltzed into my bar looking for work, and now look at us. They'll do anything for the highest bidder. Ah, Yuri wagged his finger, and that's why I make sure to always be the highest bidder. She watched as Berling's mercenaries filed into the small tunnel that led from the abyss into a remote mineshaft of Mount Gaspard. Lonato's plans had been nearly a century out of date, but they were enough for her to map out Gaspard district and the abyss underneath, and enough to trace her steps backward to return the way she had once fled from. There was a point where the concrete tunnels of abyss etched in gray and decaying green gave way to brown rock. Scattered stalactites and debris covered an uneven surface of bedrock, jagged and pointy in all the wrong places. Further than that was the white tile and smooth panels that made up the beginnings of a laboratory, though the rickety elevator a little beyond that was far too damaged to use. They would have to find a different way up. One thing about Berling's mercenaries was that they were not flashy in the slightest. Every piece of armor was utilitarian, every weapon that hung at their side was practical over elegant, and they came in all shapes and sizes. Most of them did not stand out to her, save for the captain herself. Berling was a large woman, who wielded a heavy grey axe much like Edelgard's own. Rather than clad herself in the outlandish garments and perfectly polished steel that other renowned mercenaries might have, she instead opted for a simple silver body armor with purple accents. The only thing that bound them all together was a single patch of purple, emblazoned on each of their right arms. She supposed that was Berling's favorite color, either that, or she liked the mockingbird's shade of lavender enough to copy it. The Queen of Flames, the captain greeted, holding out her hand to give a firm handshake. Edelgard reciprocated rather quickly, and stepped back a bit to size up her newfound ally. I thought you would be taller. No. Just a little less normal, I suppose. Edelgard von Hresvelg had always had a sense for the dramatic. Her armor was meant to be visible and leave a lasting impression, especially with the crimson that dotted her metal plates and her cloak. Enshrouded in shadow, only illuminated by the light of her red axe, she could not be a more menacing figure to run into in the darkness of abyss. But as an ally, she was probably a little bit more mundane. I assure you, there is almost nothing normal about our fiery friend here, Yuri said, moving forward to stand by her side. But thank you for taking me up on my offer. Anytime, Leclerc, Berling said offhandedly. You always pay. More than I can say about a lot of employers. Even though you know the risks. It's a risk, well calculated, she stated. I've taken my best men on this operation. There were about 10 of her men in a small squad. She spotted the gleaming outline of dual blades on one of them, along with a few axes, lances, and even a large greatsword that was half the size of Geralt's. Almost all of them had scars and grizzled demeanors, except for a single violet-haired man who had a strange expression etched across his face. "As have I," Yuri said. "You've met Balthus before, correct?" "Oh, I certainly have." "Hiya, Burr," said the giant of a man standing off to the side. "It's been a while." Admittedly, it was a bit strange seeing the bouncer without his chest showing, which was now covered by black and gold body armor. A pair of blade gauntlets hung at his side, worn from years of use and slightly rusty at the claw's edges. "Hasn't been long enough," she muttered. Standing behind him were two men dressed in all black hazmat suits, their eyes only visible beneath a visor much like her own. Strapped to their backs were the gas tanks of a flamethrower, and the hose stretched from the rear tank and hung at a holster from their side. It was standard protocol for a torch and burn op, though she was wondering if that was the right play for such a sensitive operation. Yuri ran a tight ship, it seemed. She could only hope that their goals for the operation aligned enough for them to cooperate. Of course, Edelgard was invested in the pair of scientists hidden in the bowels of Mount Gaspard, but it was purely out of altruism. Like many times in her life, she needed answers. "Queen," Yuri drawled. "Any backup on your end?" "My presence here should be enough," Edelgard replied coolly. "Though if you must know, I've enlisted the support of the Golden Deer's operator." "How do you manage that?" Yuri asked, one lavender eyebrow raised. "Same way you do. Money." In reality, it had been a series of unfortunate events that just happened to work out. The first was Bernadetta. She was on temporary vacation to try to settle things with her parents. The second was Claude's insistence on coming along as well. Edelgard had vehemently refused his involvement at first, but then decided that she would settle for him playing a supporting role. Claude seemed far too close to her true identity for her liking, but she was fine with one degree of separation. Thus, they compromised for the involvement of one Lysithea von Ordelia, the Golden Deer's operator who reportedly had an uncanny talent for working with machines. It also gave Edelgard a convenient opportunity to investigate her suspicions that Lysithea's platinum white hair was evidence of her being a fellow victim of the Magistrate's Research Division. She would have to look into that with some leading questions later on. "Lysithea," she said, tapping her hand on her helmet. "Do you read me?" "Loud and clear, Queen of Flames," said a voice, and the face of Lysithea von Ordelia materialized into existence on her visor. "Communications are holding steady." "Good. If the link holds here, then it'll hold inside the facility." She turned to Yuri. "After you, Mockingbird." "Fine." He cleared his throat and turned to address his men, Berling's mercenaries, and the Queen of Flames. This voice was loud and clear, a far cry from the usual snarky flirtiness he ran his bar with. "The objective of this operation is as follows: capture the two scientists trapped in the laboratory. Neutralize all threats, retrieve any pertinent information, and burn the entire operation to the ground." "Am I missing anything?" "Nope," said Balthus. "Heard you loud and clear, boss." "Good. Under no circumstances are you to harm the scientists, unless I explicitly give you permission." He motioned to Edelgard to finish. She stumbled for a bit, before she regained her composure and cleared her throat. "We have reasonable suspicion that one of the scientists may be using some sort of gravity manipulation technology," she explained in her modulated voice. "To counter this, we made something quite interesting." She rummaged into a small knapsack hanging on her side and reached out to grab a fistful of small circular devices. Each of them were metal discs with small attachments embedded in the cardinal directions, along with a small energy source centered in the middle. Edelgard took one in her other hand and slapped it on her chest theatrically, which embedded magnetically onto her breastplate and began to glow a pulsing red. For a moment the pulsing accelerated, and she felt the rhythmic pulsing of the vibration mechanism springing into action. Then the pulsing turned erratic and sped up, until it was nothing more than a faint hum throughout her body. "This," she explained, "is an experimental mechanism meant to counter whatever strange gravity manipulation used against me. I have no guarantees it will work. But it's the best way to stop her from throwing us into a wall." "Wait a minute," said the violet-haired mercenary. We're going in without knowing that it'll work. And what do you mean by throwing us into a wall? The Queen of Flames shook her head half-heartedly. It's the only chance we have. Yuri held up a hand for her to stop. She wasn't under his mercenary chain of command, but she respected his authority nonetheless. That's strictly on a need-to-know basis, he warned. And I'm not paying you a ridiculous sum to ask too many questions. The man shook his head and stepped back within the ranks of Berling's mercenaries. And besides, Yuri said, shifting back to his usual sleazy attitude. It wouldn't be fun otherwise. Balthus snorted. Berling rolled her eyes. And Edelgard remained silent, impassive beneath the smooth layer of glass that hid her lavender eyes from the world. Behind her, the entrance to the laboratory loomed before her. She dreaded the thought of entering Mount Gaspard once more, helpless beneath the strange machinations of one Constance von Novelli. And it was the scene for her first real failure as the Queen of Flames. Even if she managed to salvage the situation somewhat, the loss of Lonato and the firing of the hammer still weighed on her conscience. All those lives lost, for a cause they never signed up for. But if they succeeded now, then perhaps there was a way to soften the blow. Constance and Happy would be valuable assets, but she would have to be careful of the former. Happy could be persuaded, but Constance, she would have to be neutralized. Perhaps she could dangle the restoration of the Novelli girl's sanity as a tantalizing reward for Happy's cooperation. She heard Lysathea hum a small tune, before quickly yelping and muting herself as she came to the realization that the line was open. For some reason, despite never having met the girl face to face, she felt a certain kinship. Maybe it was the hair. Maybe it was her attitude. Or perhaps it was something more than that. Edelgard swallowed the last bit of dread in her throat and steeled herself to begin the ascent. The last month had already gone terribly. Could things get even worse from here? I don't like this place, Berling muttered. Gives me the creeps. The air around them was stale, hints of decaying flesh wafting through in an acrid stench through the ventilation systems. Even through her suit's filtration systems she could feel death emanating from every empty room and crevasse. The more she looked, the more she wanted to vomit, and the more she wanted to vomit, the less she wanted to look. They had split up into two groups, with Yuri heading one and Edelgard heading the other. Since the elevator shaft had been somewhat destroyed during their escape, they instead rappelled upward through a small ventilation tunnel and into a more disused section of the laboratory. But to call it one would be an affront to laboratories in general. Considering the decayed state of the lab's electrical systems and the blood on the walls, it looked more like an asylum than anything else. No wails or cries punctuated the halls, instead, it was an eerie silence that chilled Edelgard to the bone. She recognized a few of the rooms that they had passed by last time. Those that she had investigated already were ignored, while others were ransacked for every shred of information possible. The only documents retrieved were manifests, shipping records of people along with the goods needed to promote human experimentation. Each of them was hastily scanned and then immediately disposed of by way of fire. In a small corridor, Edelgard did a check for any assailants before kneeling down before a mangled corpse that was sprawled out in the hallway. On her visor there was a preliminary analysis of the blood stain. Drying and shade indicates time of death between a few days and a month. But as she looked closer at the body, a strange sense of déjà vu gnawed at her. The innards had been ripped out where his belly had been, a gaping hole remained. The wounds were decaying and grisly, and from the claw marks on his armor she had no doubt that one of the strange beasts roaming the laboratory had gotten to him. His head mostly remained intact, though she did not bother to lift the veil of death that was his helmet. She carefully pressed her gauntlet to his arm tucked beneath his body to reveal his insignia. A code, she whispered to herself. It was not a badge of honor, nor was it an insignia she recognized. It was instead a letter and number designation, and Edelgard knew it in her heart to be the magistrate's secret police. His armor was custom-made, pieces interlocking with one another in a carefully designed carbon fiber mesh. But it was not enough to stop whatever had gored him so brutally. She searched his body one last time, hoping to find an expose or some sort of confession as she did with Monica Oakes. But there was nothing. She settled for taking the vibro dagger clutched in his hand and attaching it to her utility belt. If he could not be useful in death, then at least his worldly possessions would be. No pity would be extended to a dog of the magistrate's research division, who allowed atrocities to occur under their noses. Down the hallway was a single room blocked by a heavy steel door. Her first instinct was to try to push at the door, which refused to budge at all. It was some kind of blast door, meant to move to the side only when the right code was entered. But unfortunately for Edelgard, she did not have time for cryptography. She would just have to break her way in. She let her hallux unfurl before carefully jamming it where the blast door closed and opened. With as much strength as she could muster, she used it as a lever to wrench the door open, feeling the metal plates groan beneath as it cut a jagged edge through the mechanism that kept the blast door in place. With some effort and some sweat on her own part, she managed to pry the door open far enough for her to stick her hands through, palms together, and push both sides of the door apart. It was a difficult moment until she felt the door click into place, her hands still outstretched and pressing on each half of the blast door. Her muscles ached and the actuators on her suit whirred in indignance, but she refused to stop here. With one last shove she pushed the doors into their open position, and braced herself for what she would see inside. It was a children's playroom. There were building blocks and various dolls scattered across the room, though some of them had been gathering dust for a long time. The walls were painted in a vivid pink and cotton candy blue despite the otherwise droll gray of the laboratory. The floor was covered in a soft carpet on one side of the room, with intricate flower patterns woven within. There were several cots in the corner of the room, but now they were stained with the dark crimson of old blood stains. On the right side of the room, apart from all the play stuff, was a single slab of metal anchored to the floor. It was too small for an adult to lay on it, but it was the right size for a young child. Various medical tools and a computer were attached to it on the side, along with a single robotic arm that hung loosely. And though whoever had used the operating table had been relatively thorough, there was no cleaning the unmistakable buildup of blood that left streaks of dim red on the steel. Her breaths turned shallow, and Edelgard struggled to maintain her composure. "Operator," she whispered into her comm link. "Are you seeing this?" The link was open, but she didn't hear any voice. For a moment she wondered if the magistrate had finally descended upon the golden deer and captured her, but the shaky breathing of a young woman on the line was the only confirmation she was alive. "I am," Lysithea finally said after what seemed to be an eternity. "And for the last time," she whispered with a hint of defiance, "don't call me that. That's not really important right now." She bit back a retort as she continued to survey the room. There was no sign of the children for which the room had been created to house. The only traces of their existence were the toys, and the occasional streaks of blood on the carpet and the walls. For some reason she could almost hear the laughter of children who were once there, blissfully unaware of their eventual fate as they found happiness in the most desolate of places. But even the shrill cry of a child's giggle faded away in her mind, and she was left with nothing but eerie silence in the room. "Goddess," Lysithea muttered hoarsely. "It's just like in Vern." "Just like what?" Edelgard asked, perhaps a bit too forcefully. "I'd rather not speak of the past." It was going to be a difficult process to get Lysithea to open up. Whatever she knew was probably guarded by years of trauma and isolation, if Edelgard was correct about her hunch. And it was not as if she could open up herself, considering her identity as the Queen of Flames had to remain intact. All she could do was listen and sympathize. No empathize, though Lysithea didn't need to know that yet. I understand, then." "I'm surprised," Lysithea said bluntly. "I thought you wouldn't take no for an answer." As she continued documenting each inch of the room by carefully scanning it with her iris cam, Edelgard kept her tone calm and collected. "I am no stranger to trauma myself. I know when it is pointless to continue pushing." The operator sighed over the line. "Then the faster we move on, the better." She made a mental note to torch the room after, and proceeded to make her exit. The thorough sweep of the compound had yielded two things so far. The first was a data chip containing several medical files for the experiments conducted at Laboratory Theta, which was ostensibly the designation given for the black site they were currently exploring. Edelgard was not exactly eager to relieve her augmentations in vivid medical detail once more, but perhaps if she could understand the process then she could use it in the future for her own well-being. There was also the possibility of replicating it under controlled conditions, though she wondered if the recipient of said augmentation process would be a consenting one. The second was the simple affirmation that the magistrate had to be destroyed at all costs. There was nothing concrete tying the magistrate to these operations. Every transaction was done off the books, every worker was given a code name, and every subject was either dead or vanished. An expose would be worthless. No doubt there would be a shell company that could be thrown under the bus, not to mention it would probably be buried by the censors. But those who had seen the experiments firsthand knew that it could only be the magistrate's research division, all the way down from the funding to the scientists themselves. There was also a third thing that concerned Edelgard, though it was less of a discovery and more of the lack of one. The monsters were nowhere to be seen. So far, they had managed to map the top 2 levels of the laboratory by splitting into 2 teams. Sonar imaging had confirmed that there were 4 levels, and the lab of Constance and Happy had to be somewhere in the bottom 2. The ventilation shaft that they had used ran all the way through the laboratory vertically and into the old mines, which served as the reference point for most of their mapping. It was the only thing that matched up with the map that Governor Lonato had given to her, and it was also probably the only thing keeping them from being lost. But before they went on downwards, it was time for Edelgard's team to assemble and regain some semblance of order within the labyrinth. The hallways were already confusing enough, it would be worse if some of the men were lost within, searching desperately for an escape route. "All rooms clear," said Berlin, who looked none the worse for wear beneath her helmet. "Shay, did you and Getz find anything of note?" "Not particularly," replied the mercenary. "Lots of dead bodies. No resistance. All of the cameras are dead." "Well, tell me something I don't know," she snorted. "It's fucking disturbing, that's what it is." "Queen," she asked, turning toward Edelgard. "Has your operator friend found anything so far?" "Nothing you need to know about." "Oh, great. Cryptic as usual. Unless you want to throw in your lot with the Black Eagles, I suggest you don't pry any further," Edelgard warned. "Fair enough. Even being near you seems risky enough," she scoffed. "The Mockingbird had to cough up a lot of credits to even make me consider the offer." "Would you not throw away all that you had to save a friend?" Edelgard asked. Berlin remained quiet, her head bowed in silent contemplation. "Dismas," Edelgard commanded, turning toward the man working for Yuri with a flamethrower. "Has everything been burned?" "If it lights, it goes up in smoke," he replied from underneath his fume mask. "I think I did a pretty thorough job." "Good. I hope for your sake that you did," she said with a hint of menace in her tone, and the man shrunk back slightly. "She's scary," someone whispered. "I kinda like that," someone else whispered back. "She can hear you," the mercenary who was probably named Shay hissed. The Queen of Flames just shook her head in disappointment. In the meantime, she made a theatrical display of pressing her right hand to the side of her helmet and making an outgoing call to Yuri. After a few seconds, the line clicked, though it was filled with static and the hiss of white noise. "Noth, so, quiet here." "Yuri, I can't hear you. Is something blocking the signal?" "I think yes. Goddess damn it, Leclerc." She indignantly cut the call, but from Lysithea's readout it seemed that his vitals, along with the rest of the squad, were all right. She was unsure why Lysithea's communications could pass through, but the closer squads could not. It had to be some sort of electromagnetic interference or another magistrate security protocol. But she would simply have to operate under the assumption that Yuri's team was all right. "Queen?" Berlin asked, tapping her on her arm. She resisted the urge to flinch, and turned to meet the woman's eyes. "Is Yuri's team good?" "Yes." "Good. I'd like the last half of our payment, so I'd prefer if he didn't die." "Seconded," chortled another one of Berlin's mercenaries. "I need to pay off my bar tab," grumbled another. "You'll get paid. Relax. We heading down?" Berlin asked. Edelgard nodded in confirmation, though she was not exactly excited to do so. The very first thing they saw once they stepped out of the stairwell was a beast charging toward the group, lunging straight at the Queen of Flames. She heard the footsteps before anyone else, and once it was within visual range she wasted no time in pulling out her holocs. Edelgard could vaguely describe it as a lizard crossed with a saber-toothed tiger, scaly in all the right places in a strangle model of black and brown. The fangs jutted out from beneath the beast's maw, dripping with a slime that she did not particularly want to touch. This one was the size of a large wolf, and in spite of its size, it had the speed and energy of a small but angry dog. When it pounced towards her head, she resisted the urge to try to cleave it in two. That would only serve to enrage it, and from her last foray into Mount Gaspard it also wouldn't do anything due to the beast's abnormally resilient scales. Instead, she opted to duck under it and deliver a strike to its belly, which seemed to be a bit less guarded than its resilient carapace. It soared over with a loud roar, and she slid underneath while delivering a massive blow upwards with her axe. The strike was true, and it ripped a black gash in the beast's belly as the hollow blade cut through flesh and sinew. The force of the impact was enough to slam it into the ceiling with a loud thump, stopping its forward momentum and causing it to crash into the ground as Edelgard leapt to her feet. She whirled around to see the rest of the team staring at the beast and her with weapons drawn, dumbfounded. But she could not let her guard down until she knew the strange monster was dead, so she remained in a steady stance. It whimpered as it writhed on the floor belly up, black ooze coming out of the wound as its innards began to spill out. Edelgard elected to put it out of its misery by delivering a swift blow to where the plating on its neck seemed weakest, which separated its head from its body and stopped the otherworldly sound coming from its vocal cords. For a moment it moved, and she feared that decapitation would not be enough to kill it, but then it went still. She breathed a filtered sigh of relief from beneath her mask. "What in the hell was that?" someone shouted in anger and confusion. "Good question. I'd like to know as well," Berling said, her hand resting on the pommel of her sword now that it was sheathed. "Looked like a big-ass lizard with fangs." "Yuri briefed you on the wildlife, did he not?" Edelgard asked mockingly. "No." "Well, consider yourself briefed," she said. "The magistrate's science experiments are resistant to conventional weaponry through their scales and carapaces. Aim for the joints, or use blunt force to break through." "I get that," said the man known as Getz, "but that still doesn't explain anything." "If I had more answers," Edelgard replied icily, "I wouldn't tell you anyway. You and your secrets." "Fine. Just as long as we kill these things quick." "Dismas," Edelgard called abruptly. "Burn the body." The signature whoosh and the feeling of tingling heat on her body meant that Dismas was currently hard at work burning what was left of the carcass. She watched as the black ooze and its strange limbs went up in flames, until nothing was left but a charred pair of black fangs covered in ash. She picked it up in each hand before closing her fists tightly, crushed bone dust spilling out from between her metal fingertips. This layer of the compound was mostly dark. She flipped on the flashlight built into her left gauntlet, shining a beam of light that punctured the darkness and revealed even more blood-stained tiles. There were no more monsters in sight, but it really didn't hurt to be a bit careful. "Form groups of 3, Edelgard commanded. "Search the rooms one by one, but don't stray too far from the other groups. And try to engage with the wildlife as little as possible." "Fucking things aren't wildlife," one of the mercenaries groaned. "They're monsters. Not the point. You let your guard down, you die. Am I clear?" She looked expectantly at the group. They all gave affirmations in their own unique way, with Berling taking off her helmet and tipping it Edelgard's way, the purple-haired man flashing a thumbs up, and there were a few curt nods. "Our goal is to find the lab and the scientists inside, along with re-establishing communications with Yuri's group. The less we tangle with those things," Edelgard explained, "the better. Can you get me a sample of the black ooze?" Lysithea buzzed in her ear. "I'd like to run some of my own tests on the compounds present." "Fine," she hissed. "If you think you'll make a breakthrough, then we will collect samples." She was beginning to regret burning the carcass, but she supposed that only a few samples were necessary. Edelgard now focused her attention on Berling's mercenaries, who picked up on the word sample and began to groan. "Is there anybody remotely intelligent here?" Edelgard asked. "I am," said one man, who was older than the rest. "Name's Frenius." There were a few muffled chuckles and even a witty remark, but Edelgard did not pay any mind to it. "You're on sample duty," the Queen of Flames said coldly. "Don't burn the bodies before Frenius here gets up close and personal." The man groaned and thumped his heated great axe on the floor in disapproval, but she did not budge. "Anybody else want to volunteer?" The laboratory remained silent. Only the sound of a light breeze passed through the empty halls, and were it not for the filtration systems in her suit she could smell the decay in the air. But as the flashlights of the mercenaries began to turn on, illuminating the hallway in a kaleidoscope of various shades of white and yellow, she began to feel a bit of hope about the whole operation. There was always the chance that the beasts had simply found new hunting grounds, and that it would be the magistrate's problem now. Or, there was also the possibility that Happy had figured out a way to contain most of them. It was fun to entertain the ideas in her head, as she dared to hope the plan would go well. But as usual, any hope turned out to be quite unwarranted. "That's 12, Lysithea counted." Edelgard wrenched her axe out of an avian beast's body and kicked it to the side. It was a lot easier to deal with them one by one, or in the case of a particularly unfortunate mercenary, 2 by 2. The handle of her axe was covered in sticky black goo and various pieces of bone, though any residue left on the projected blade had been vaporized. Edelgard herself was covered in filth, streaks of black and gray covering her red and black armor plates. Though none of it had gotten on her skin underneath her protective bodysuit, her skin still crawled at the thought. It was clear to her that Berling's mercenaries were as good as they claimed to be. Despite not having a particularly well-defined battle plan, under the leadership of their captain they managed to hold their own against what seemed to be a trickle of strange beasts hell-bent on eating them. Of note was the mercenary named Shay, whose twin vibroblades flashed in arcs of violet through even the largest of beasts. Though all of them had various nicks and scratches from their combat, no one had been seriously injured so far. The most notable thing about them was their camaraderie. Berling didn't need to shout out commands, rather, she charged, and her men followed without question. They felt more like her own black eagles, tied together by a common goal, rather than the blade breakers who were in pursuit of money. Yes, Berling was greedy, but so was every other mercenary in the business. Edelgard could at least respect a band of thieves that stuck together, even if they all claimed to be in it for the money. "Clear," Edelgard called out over the radio. She moved toward the next room, the light embedded in her gauntlet carving a path for her to follow. Berling and her men were not far behind, and the relative quiet aside from footsteps and whispered chatter was a good sign. The rooms were still a spiraling labyrinth of odd corridors and rooms arranged in a way that defied logic, but she was beginning to get a picture of the entire lab itself. The bodies were recent, probably the Minders assigned to Constance, and happy to make sure they didn't stray too far from the magistrate's goals. But the complex itself was older than that. Some of the wire connectors were rendered obsolete over a decade ago, and the blood samples taken ranged from a week to over 2 decades old, if not more. How long had they been here? And had Lonato really been oblivious to this happening underneath his nose? Most of the important documents had been cleared out. Getz had found several hard drives that were burnt until only the casing remained intact. There were no tools remaining, and even the laboratory equipment was gone save for the ones that were bolted down onto the tile floor. The only shreds of evidence were relatively recent, and all of them were redacted to the point of being unreadable. "Lysithea," Edelgard asked out of the blue. "What do you think?" "Think about what?" "Don't play dumb," she chided over the link. "The lab. What we've seen. All of this." "Well," the young woman paused for a moment. "It's certainly something. Damn Lysithea and her ability to keep her composure under pressure." She was a strong-willed person, and though there were hints of the trauma underneath, she did her best to remain tight-lipped about what she knew. If only there was a way to communicate, beyond the veneers of the Golden Deer's operator and the infamous Queen of Flames, survivor to survivor. But there was not. "This isn't the first time you've seen something like this." "No," Lysithea said, after a pause. "It isn't." Edelgard rested her hand on one of the railings that stretched through the hallway, and when she let go she found her armored glove stained with black goo and flecks of dried blood. She thought about what to say, and it was quite the conundrum. At least she knew how to soothe Bernadetta into revealing information, or egg Claudon into revealing his hand. But Lysithea? From all initial assessments she was cold. Proud, but cold. It was something she could use. "Claude, then." "Claude, what?" "He's keeping you from saying anything, isn't he?" "No, Lysithea spluttered out. "As if I'd ever let that nosy prick tell me when and what to say. I seem to have struck a nerve." "I get it," Edelgard said with mock concern. He runs the golden deer ragged, so he runs you ragged most of all, and since he likes his secrets so much dash. I'm not being run ragged, goddess, dammit, I'm here because I want to be, she shouted. Not because Claude's ordering me around. So, you asked to take point, Edelgard noted. Claude had no say in this. He couldn't stop me if he tried. And he did try, you know. I can't blame him for trying, Edelgard stated in a solemn tone. As much as I hate Claude, he's just trying to protect you. Wadash. I know what it's like, she continued, to revisit your past. It hurts. Maybe that's why Claude didn't want you here. But something compelled you anyway. Facing your fears? Morbid curiosity? Or maybe it's that you want to see the truth for yourself. She heard a huff over the line. Then the sound of air being sucked in. Bingo. You don't have to tell me anything, Edelgard conceded. But you're here for the same reason as I am, aren't you? As Lysithea sat quietly, Edelgard opened the door to check another room. This was much like the rest of them, consoles that no longer had power, desks that had long since been cleared, and the ever-present stench of decay present in the air. Only a single thing stood out to her, a framed photo of a young girl, whose colors had faded over the years, placed nicely upon a shelf. That was the only source of life remaining in the room, and she decided to take it and place it inside a loose pouch on her right thigh. Then the comlink buzzed one more. I just want to know why, Lysithea whispered. Time to take a risk. Why the magistrate experiments on people. Or why your family had to die. There was silence over the call. Had she gone too far this time? How dare you, Lysithea growled, her solemnity giving way to icy anger. And how do you even dash? It's no secret House Ordelia has been plagued by several illnesses in the past years. Considering that you are not actively involved in your family's pharmaceutical company and instead fighting against the magistrate, I can only assume that they had something to do with it. There was a cold detachment in her voice, as if she was reading off of an article. And she had done her research quite well, digging up information about House Ordelia that perhaps Lysithea did not even know. But until Lysithea herself confirmed that the magistrate was responsible, they were only suspicions, and perhaps Edelgard was merely biased because it was eerily similar to her own life. You make it sound like it's an obvious conclusion, Queen, spat Lysithea. Gone was the melancholy and regret, replaced with carefully hidden anger bubbling to the surface. But it doesn't matter. You don't know me. I don't. But I know a survivor when I see one. What do you know about surviving? Lysithea growled. This time, it was Edelgard's turn to remain silent, which spoke for itself. Queen of Flames, Lysithea said, her tone softening. So that's how. Are you? Has your hair always been that shade of platinum? Edelgard asked abruptly, electing to ignore her original line of questioning. What? Never mind, she lied, feigning disinterest. Just a hunch. Waste disposal has failed, Shay read off the console. Experiments 307 to 395 loose in the compound. Requesting backup at once. I'm assuming it's referring to these. Berling said, turning around. The captain gestured to the brick wall behind them. Rows and rows of once red bricks lined the walls, surrounding several massive slabs of metal embedded into the wall. The handle on them seemed to suggest they were some kind of door, or at least an opening hatch to something. Around the metal doors, the brick went from a faded brown to being covered with a thick layer of soot. The rest of the room was empty, save for the massive gouges carved into the cold stone floor by unknown means. Gone were the streaks of blood or the flecks of black goo, it was replaced with a surgical cleanliness. Open it, the Queen of Flames commanded. Shay looked back, one hand on his left sword and the other resting on his hip. It was the first time Edelgard had really looked at him, but as she tried to make sense of his armor and the odd red scarf wrapped around his neck, she paused. He doesn't belong here. The gnawing headache in her brain turned to a fever pitch of pins and needles, but she managed to steady herself against the wall. There was something strange about the mercenary, from the violet hair to the odd fighting style of using dual swords. But her initial mistrust gave way to utter confusion. It wasn't that Shay did not belong in the compound, she felt as if Shay did not belong in this world at all. For some reason, An old adage sprung to mind. Even the smallest of changes can ripple across time. Queen, the mercenary asked unsteadily. Are you sure about this? Yes. You don't look so good over there, he said with worry. His face was filled with concern, and the bright and youthful expression he had when Edelgard first met him was now gone. Edelgard swallowed the bile in her throat and willed herself to stand straight and proud. She walked over next to Shay and motioned for him to continue. Yes. Open it. Her modulated voice rang through loud and clear, and all of the men and women gathered in the room did not question her authority. With both hands Shay pulled open the metal slab, and immediately a cloud of black dust rushed out. Instinctively he tumbled away, rushing to cover his mouth and nose, but none of the sensors in Edelgard's armor went off. The lack of radiation and toxins meant that it would not be fatal. But the smell she recognized even through the filtration system in her helmet. It wasn't poison. It was ash. She peered inside to see a metal gurney, charred black from flame and heat, sitting in a dark space that extended a few feet deep and upwards. Her flashlight revealed a series of plasma coils that were rusted from disuse, which she guessed were the heating elements. An incinerator, Lysathea whispered into Edelgard's left ear. Shay was still coughing, but when offered help the man brushed it off and muttered that he was going to be fine. She would have opened it herself, but she wanted the men present on the operation to see firsthand what exactly was going on here. Lying in the center of the gurney were a few dozen small objects, unmistakably in the shape of human bones. They were neatly arranged, and they were also far too small to be for an adult. It chilled Edelgard down to her very soul. At least they had the mercy to kill them first this time. My goddess, one of the men whispered. Is that human? Another whimpered. I have half a mind, Berlin growled, to blow this ungodly fucking place to smithereens. I agree, Edelgard said calmly, but not before we get what we came here for, Edelgard warned. Phineas, bag the remains. The older man looked at her, horrified. I. If you can't stand the sight of human remains, Edelgard stated, I'll do it myself. How? Shay muttered. How can the Queen of Flames you be so calm right now? He was on the verge of retching, doubled over with one hand pressed firmly against the wall. The rest of Berling's men were faring just as well, judging from their horrified expressions and a reluctance to even come near Edelgard and the incinerator behind her. I have merely become accustomed to the magistrate's cruelty firsthand. Does it matter? Berling shouted. She was losing her composure, and the stoic image of the captain vanished as she let her emotions take the wheel. I get it now. I was in denial all this time, but seeing the incinerator made me certain. They're experimenting on people and burning the goddess-damned bodies. And there's fucking monsters running around the facility. I thought this was supposed to be a rescue mission, not exploring hell itself. That's Yuri's objective. Mine is to find the truth. What truth? That this facility was run by a bunch of depraved, sick fucks. I wanted, Edelgard stated, to understand what they were trying to do. There is nothing on this earth that can justify what they have done. But to find out what they were trying to achieve, only then can we stop them. Stop them, another woman interjected. The world needs to know about this first. Lazai, Getz said, putting a reassuring hand on her shoulder. If we did that, we'd all disappear. And how can we prove that this is the magistrate's doing, anyway? Anybody with a fucking brain could figure that out. And what if they disappear too? You think the magistrate's going to let people spread rumors that they're experimenting on people? Fat chance. Stop, Edelgard said, holding her hands up in defeat. If any of you are uncomfortable, then you are free to leave. But I'm willing to see this operation to the end, so that those who died here can find some sort of justice. But should we even be rescuing the scientists, if they were here for all of this? Shay said. They're, complicit, Berling finished with darkness in her eyes. They're complicit in all of this. Not until I get the information I need. After that, take it up with your employer. Her eyes narrowed at the mercenaries standing around the entrance. Back to work. Phineas. He sighed, deep and weary. But he did not protest, and so he began the process of carefully collecting the remains in the incinerator, treating them with the respect that they deserved. The rest of the men and women awkwardly shuffled out of the room, and once the older mercenary was done, he also followed them out. Edelgard stayed, running her hand along the brick wall as her thoughts raced. "I remember these," said Lysithea solemnly. "I caught a glimpse of them one time, and I could feel the heat coming from them all the way from outside. Similar facilities. But not these specifically." "No." Edelgard shook her head, forgetting that the operator could not see her face or body. "I never saw these. I only remembered the pit." "A pit? But dash. That's enough, Lysithea," Edelgard warned. "I've already said too much. You were the one asking me questions," she complained. "And yet you feel the same way about your past. I don't like revealing personal information very much. But maybe one day, when this is all over." It seemed as if Berling's mercenaries had aged by years once they got to the generator room. They were weary, eyes gaunt and sunken, their gait solemn and slow. Monsters were dispatched without any question or hesitation. Evidence was collected methodically and thoroughly. The only communications were about the operation itself. In their profession, it paid to be callous. They were no stranger to bloody death and gore. But it was exploring the depths of humanity's depravity inside the laboratory that really began to eat at them. Whatever conclusions each of them reached after witnessing the incinerator room began to eat at them, and she knew that it was a matter of time before they were unable to take it any longer. Edelgard knew that look. She knew it all too well. The cold indifference that Edelgard felt came from the fact that she had already grown desensitized to the horrors of human experimentation. She herself was an unwilling test subject, and the scars she bore from her augmentations remained with her beneath the red and gold armor of the Queen of Flames. And as she walked the halls and checked the rooms, Edelgard was reminded of her own past in more ways than one. Sometimes she would encounter a body, or a relic of someone's personal life left behind in an abandoned room. It was only human for her to feel pity. But the trails of bloody residue that could not be scrubbed away reminded her that they had been witness to atrocities, and did nothing about it. Any pity she felt was replaced by an icy anger. Lysithea, too, felt the same way. But there would be a long way to go before they could have an earnest conversation with one another about their trauma. Despite the kinship of shared suffering, the pale-haired woman remained a stranger to Edelgard. And still there was no signal from Yuri. He was not dead yet, that much she knew for sure. But there were worse fates than death, and Edelgard's team had only taken care of the odd-numbered floors. Based on what she had seen, there was a very real possibility that even more grotesque horrors lurked in the shadows, not to mention the looming danger of one Constance von Novelli. So far, the 3 hours Edelgard had spent exploring felt more like 3 years. "Should we turn the power on?" Shay asked. "Negative," Edelgard said, shaking her head. "Not until we know it's safe to do so. But if we do that, then there's proof that this place is connected to the Empire, right?" "I don't think it's that simple," the woman named Lazai stated. "Doing so might endanger the whole operation, and we'd never have a chance to get that information." Before them, a massive fusion tokamak loomed ominously behind a thick sheet of transparent glass, metal arranged in a massive torus that hid the contents inside. It lacked the typical glow of an active reactor, and some of the cables connecting it to the research facility's infrastructure were frayed and broken. It was almost as if they had been chewed through. "I don't even know where to turn it on," admitted Shay. "It's a risk we might have to take," suggested Berling. "It would activate the communication systems so that we can send signals between floors. And, if the consoles turn on, then we can get some information out of it." "We're already torching the place," Dismas pointed out. "Might as well take a bit of a risk." She heard a click, and suddenly she heard a rapid pulsing that accelerated to a low hum. Slowly but surely the torus began to glow with orange heat, as the fusion reaction went critical and started to sustain itself. She watched as the wires that remained quickly went taut, and then as the lights began to turn on one by one in the facility. So, too, did the consoles in the room that they stood in, as green lines of code ran down the archaic screen into a rudimentary operating system. "What just happened?" Edelgard asked. Shay sheepishly held up his hands. I leaned on a lever by accident. Well, I don't know if I should kill you or thank you. Shit. Lysithea shouted over the comm link. Excuse my language. What is it? Edelgard said, pressing her hand to her helmet. Turning the power on re-established communications with the magistrate. I'm detecting data being sent over the frequency bands they use. Of course the facility would phone home. She cursed herself for not thinking about that in advance. How long do we have? Edelgard asked. An hour at most. Depends on how fast they can scramble a response team. Edelgard relayed that information to the mercenaries present, which was not exactly received warmly. That can't be good, can it? Is that enough time? We need to get out of here, Berlin shouted. Where's Yuri? Calling him right now. Edelgard immediately dialed Yuri as fast as possible, which was promptly picked up only a second or two later. Have you found Constance? Yuri asked, the signal now crystal clear. Whatever jamming mechanism had been disabled by the restoration of power, and now they were able to communicate just fine. Is your team all right? No and yes, Edelgard said bluntly. Are you on the 4th floor? Yes. We swept the 2nd, and now we're with Happy in her laboratory. So that's where they were. But you haven't seen Constance? No. I was hoping dash. Immediately she watched as one of Berling's soldiers was skewered by a stray piece of metal, only saved by the fact that it was through her forearm rather than her torso as she twisted. She screamed in pain, before another chunk of metal careened toward them from the hallway outside. This was cut in half by Berling with her purple hollow sword, the halves harmlessly falling to the ground. Edelgard immediately motioned for the downed mercenary to receive aid, and then rushed forward to cover the entrance with her hollow shield. A few more sharp objects were thrown at it with dizzying speed, and she could tell from the propagation of small cracks in the projected energy shield that it would not last long. It could be only one person. Constance, she shouted. Show yourself. The woman in question floated into view, beams of energy shooting from her fingertips as she slowly lowered herself to the ground from where she had been hovering. She now wore a sheer black dress, still with the tensor machinery running up and down her arms and backside. Her faded blue eyes locked with Edelgard's own beneath her red visor, and in it she saw the desperation of a feral animal. I will not have you destroy this laboratory, she screeched. For House Novelli. Oh, they had found Constance, all right. It was a shame her idea of a proper greeting was trying to kill them all. Chapter 39, Stains of Time. Novelli Pharmaceuticals was the leading supplier of advanced medical technology and synthetic compounds, with a monopoly over some of the most esoteric drugs known to mankind. Led by its namesake, the Great House Novelli, it helped usher in an era of long life expectancy and the curing of most illnesses. Rumor had it that it came at a great cost, from blood experiments to organ trafficking, in order to supply the necessary flesh for their tests. Some even believed that they had found a way to cheat death, defying the God Emperor with the promise of a better, eternal life. But whatever the case, it was not enough to save themselves when a suicide attack by Dodden separatists took out Novelli Orbital Station, leading in the complete destruction of one of the most celebrated noble bloodlines. The noble families of Newfoundland, original manuscript before redactions. Stand behind me! Edelgard yelled backwards with all the fury she could muster. Though her vocal cords ached, the synthesizer in her mask smoothed out any vestiges of her original voice, leaving only a harsh metallic tone devoid of humanity. Shield integrity compromised, a weak AI voice buzzed inside her helmet. Not even a millisecond after her suit assessed the damage, the red hollow shield that was attached to her left arm was immediately struck by several projectiles at high speed. They shattered into bits and pieces of ceramic and broken metal, clattering to the floor. The energy transfer from making contact with the shield had been quite severe, and glowing red cracks began to propagate through the dim crimson glow that made up the energy field. It meant that she was in a losing position, especially since she was on the defensive and stuck in a corridor with her team on one end and Constance von Novelli on another. Edelgard kept her left arm steady, elbow jutting outward and forearm shielding her body as she dropped down to one knee. By lowering her center of gravity and bracing herself against the floor, she could reduce the knockback from the projectiles and thus remain steady. The shield was designed to absorb the brunt of the kinetic impact by converting it into energy, but it would not last forever, and a sufficiently large hit would destroy it entirely. Through the double filter of red from her visor and her hollow shield, she peered through to Constance von Novelli in all of her glory. She couldn't see much other than her outline within the darkness, except for the lines of green energy that ran up and down her dress and toward her gloves. They flared with green light as Constance aimed her hand at the sideboards, ripping it and the flooring out with a clawed gesture. She then closed her fist in order to compress it with an ominous crunch, and hurled it directly towards Edelgard with an overhand swing. It landed against her shield with a massive thud, clattering to the ground. Edelgard bit back a curse as she watched the cracks grow even larger. Berling's mercenaries scrambled to take up combat positions, swords drawn and trying to figure out where they should stand if Edelgard's shield fell. A couple tried their best to form triage on the wounded woman, who had been with a barrage of projectiles to her chest and torso. She whimpered weakly as they applied a medical salve and bandaged her wounds, dragging her out of the line of fire. Edelgard felt a pang of pity at how helpless normal humans were before Constance. But the rest of them were running around like headless chickens, unsure of what to attack or do since Edelgard was blocking the hallway with her shield. They certainly couldn't strike at Constance, it would be suicide, since they had neither the strength or speed to dodge the onslaught of material thrown at them. Still, they could be useful in other ways, she thought, and so she whipped her head around and towards the others to bark orders. "Shay, Berlin. You're in charge of making sure no one gets in here," she commanded. "Everyone else, we need that data at all costs. I want all teams extracting information from the servers and collecting every shred of evidence, down to the last speck." "Is that really our priority?" the captain yelled back as another projectile hit Edelgard's shield hard enough to make her skid backwards an inch or two. "She's like a damn hurricane. If we don't stop her, we'll dash. Without it, this operation is meaningless," the Queen of Flames snarled at her temporary subordinates. "Get the wounded out and the data alongside them. I'll hold her back." One more compressed cluster of tiling and glass hit her shield, and it shattered into red shards that faded away into ethereal sparks. Immediately Edelgard stumbled backwards, only barely catching herself with her left hand. A used energy cell popped out of her left gauntlet, and with her right hand she smashed a smoke canister on the ground. Smoke began to fill the hallway, thick and heavy in the air. It was one part carcinogenic dust cloud and part distraction, and she instinctively fought the urge to cough despite her suit's filtration systems. The only sign that Constance was still there inside the black smoke was an occasional thud and a low-frequency humming that must have been her tensors. Edelgard grimaced, and held her crimson hallux high in preparation for anything else that might have come her way. Then a small beam of green light struck her in the chest through the cloud of dust. She braced herself for impact, but nothing happened. "Why won't it work?" a voice screeched through the darkness. She was now reminded of the vibration inducer buzzing on her chest, creating a frequency high enough to be unnoticeable but weak enough to be harmless. Linhardt's hypothesis had been proven in the field. The constant changing of her position, as minute as vibration was, made it difficult for Constance and her tensors to lock onto her position. But she was a smart woman, and would undoubtedly figure out a different way to kill Edelgard. Clever tricks, using vibrations. "But it won't save you," she growled, and another object sailed through the smoke and barely missed her. Without her shield, she was batting blindly with her axe, trying her best to block anything from sailing through the doorway. She would need to find time to let it recharge, which was a resource she did not have. "Lysithea. Put me through to Yuri." Within a few keystrokes the connection was made. There was no need to confirm her command when lives were on the line. "Queen," greeted a familiar voice dripping with sarcasm. "It looks like we found her," Edelgard shouted over the line, as a hail of small glass shards began to rain down upon her. Most bounced harmlessly off of her armor, but she made sure to guard the vital points between the plates of her suits. "Are you going to do something about it?" "Hey," a woman in the background said offhandedly. "Is that the Flame Emperor?" "Queen," Yuri corrected. She had no time to snap back in a response as she barely dodged past a ceramic tile moving at the speed of a freight train. "Oh, so Flame Queen. My bad." "She's a bit occupied," shrugged Yuri. "I do apologize on behalf of my companion." "Thanks," Edelgard gritted out, slicing a steel beam careening toward her as it crashed to the floor in several pieces. Oh, is she fighting Coco? I hope she doesn't get hurt too badly. Her blood began to boil. Constance was about to take her head off, and yet they were idly chattering as if nothing was happening. What had Yuri's team been doing, anyway? She was about to scream before Yuri continued to speak. If you'll excuse my indifference, Yuri explained, I'm currently convincing Happy to come with us. Which really doesn't solve the problem at hand. Edelgard caught a shard of metal with her left hand, crunching beneath the weight of her closing fist as she threw it to the ground. A maelstrom of objects surrounded Constance von Novelli before her, strange green light illuminating each one as they swirled around her. Somehow her perfect blonde hairdo remained intact despite the chaos surrounding her. But her expression was filled with rage, and with a grand gesture she pulled several objects and sent them flying toward the hallway. Shay and Berlin were hanging behind her, taking whatever was left of the room and storing them in nylon knapsacks. It was a low-tech solution, but there wasn't anything better for the time being. It was Edelgard's job to distract Constance while they scoured the place for every bit of information. And she would be a good distraction. It's the only way we can stop Constance, Yuri muttered darkly. You won't be able to take her down without her help. Who's to say she'll help at all? It's worth a shot. I'll send the rest of the men to relieve you guys while me and Balthus stay and talk. And besides, he said, while tut-tutting in an infuriating way. It's better than just trying to smash your way through, isn't it, Queen? Good luck. She tried to spit a scathing reply in return, but the line went dead before she could do so. Damn Yuri and his bleeding heart. For all of his bluster as the Abyss's preeminent fixer and part-time crime lord, he had a soft side hidden underneath his witty facade. It was a rare side of him that Edelgard had only caught glimpses of so far. Now, deep inside the bowels of Mount Gaspard on a mission to save some of his old friends, she knew that his sentimentality would be the death of him. She could not count on his help in the moment, as he was too clouded by emotion to make a sound judgment. For now, Edelgard was on her own. She sighed, casually leaning to her right to dodge a block of concrete only for it to barely miss Shay. He yelped, leaping to his feet and sliding out of view and out of the firing range. Edelgard was gaining ground, but only a few inches at a time. Each step was punctuated by several heavy projectiles hurtling toward her, and whenever she was hit she slid backwards to take the brunt of the impact. It was not exactly a winning situation. It was high time Edelgard went on the offensive. And while she had made a promise that Constance would remain alive, she could not promise that she would be completely unharmed. With a surge of renewed energy she began to dash forward, vaulting from her standing position into long strides. She dragged her axe by her side, bringing it upwards to cleave through an incoming tile and pushing past the cloud of debris that shrouded her vision. Several dozen feet ahead was the hovering form of Constance von Novelli, covered in green light emanating from her fingertips and feet. I'm running an analysis of her tensor gloves right now, Lysathea stated over the comm link. Want me to run you through play-by-play? Never mind that, just tell me how to neutralize her. She heard the clacking of a mechanical keyboard as Edelgard struggled to stay upright from the impact of a spinning steel rod clipping her left leg. Lysathea was old school, she was more attuned to machinery and circuitry than netrunning. It was no wonder that she eschewed hollow screens and hand gestures for the familiar feel of a mouse and keyboard, archaic tools from the Silicon Age. If you could stop her hand movements, that would be good. Her tensors convert neural impulses and muscle movement into manipulator movement. If she can't move anything. A bit easier said than done. Edelgard ducked under a massive steel girder that would have decapitated her. It embedded itself firmly into the sides of the hallway, digging out a large groove before coming to a stop with a deafening screech. Though it was enough to stop her sprint, her momentum continued to carry her forward, as she kept her head high and her eyes pointed at the woman laying siege using the very walls as material. Sever her connection to the tensors, Lysathea said blithely. If only she could get within striking range, then maybe she could sever a hand or two. Physically or mentally, she added. Either works. Easier said than done. She surged through the hallway and into the room where Constance had been hiding. It was some sort of a theater, with red padded seats arranged in an amphitheater layout around a central stage. It was large enough to host maybe 100 people, but it was completely out of place from the rusted and utilitarian layout of the rest of the facility. No doubt this was meant to be some sort of gathering room, perhaps for discussion of the sick and twisted experiments the scientists conjured up. But the majority of it was completely destroyed, as rubble and tile were scattered across the aisles with reckless abandon. Many of the chairs had been ripped out of their positions, leaving nothing but pieces of metal jutting from the floor. Even the soundproofing had been destroyed, torn to shreds as if a tornado had crashed through the room. Well, that part was mostly true, thanks to Constance. But from the amount of dust across the damaged seats, the faded colors on the seats, the curtains that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years, it all pointed to a single truth. Constance had done a number to the auditorium with her gravity manipulation. But she hadn't been the only one. Not by a long shot. It had already been destroyed many years ago, she was simply tearing up what was left. The woman in question was simply hovering a few millimeters above the main stage. The whirling maelstrom of objects was no longer above her head, as pieces of debris were scattered haphazardly by her side and below the stage. Her face was haggard, and the perfect blonde hair was now replaced by messy locks that hung below her neck and shoulders. Her eyes were gaunt and sunken, and bloody streaks marred her otherwise perfect skin. This was the real Constance. For a second Edelgard considered if the perfect hair from before had been a hologram, but she realized that it must have been one of the things she used her tensors to manipulate. And without the storm circling her, she looked as vulnerable and as tired as any normal girl could have been. Perhaps there was a chance for diplomacy. "Constance von Novelli," Edelgard called out. "I just want to talk." She didn't even glance in her direction. "This place, it brings back memories," Constance whispered, her eyes unfocused and staring off into the distance. "What?" "Mother, she used to take me here." "But that doesn't make sense," Edelgard thought. "How would the matriarch of House Novelli know about this place? And why would she bring her own child here, when they were specifically targeting the children of nobles to experiment on?" She fanned herself, not paying attention to the armored woman standing amidst the rubble of a destroyed auditorium. Constance seemed to be staring at something that did not exist, speaking to someone that wasn't entirely there. Edelgard caught snippets of her babbling, jumbled thoughts from Constance's stream of consciousness that made no sense. The plays they put on, to keep the children happy. "Mother, let me see once." "I've deciphered some of the past communiques from this place," interrupted Lysithea into Edelgard's ear, as she struggled to make sense of what she was witnessing. "It makes reference to the old matriarch of House Novelli. Shipping manifestos, lab reports, incident files, everything." "Yvonne," Edelgard said, recalling a woman with flowing blonde hair and distinctive hoop earrings. "Mother never used to like her." "You know her?" Lysithea asked, and an awkward silence fell between them. Edelgard was almost thankful when Constance began to mutter again. "I never knew, not until they took me back here in chains, but Mother knew, she knew all along, and she never told me." A porcelain pot of some sorts shattered in the distance, echoing through the barren auditorium eerily. Constance was beginning to unravel in more ways than one. Slowly Edelgard began to understand, which was a rare occurrence in Newfoundland these days. Whatever the old Novelli had been doing, she was just as guilty as every scientist and guard in this facility, considering she had to have known about what was going on beneath Mount Gaspard. But to have the gall to bring her daughter along, well, that was only if Constance was to be believed. Edelgard was operating under the assumption that beneath the mask, there were bits of sanity beneath. All she had to do was poke until they could be revealed to the world. It also explained why the magistrate had taken Constance. Perhaps her mother had experimented on her own daughter. She would not be too surprised at that. Edelgard was a bit glad that all of House Novelli had perished in the Dodden-Brigid War, at the hands of a suicide attack by a lone Dodden operative. Constance was all that was left, and it might have been better for her if she hadn't survived. "Goddess, there's just so many documents," Lysithea complained. 10 years old at the very latest, all postmarked with Novelli. "Does this mean that the whole facility was owned by House Novelli?" Edelgard finished. "I have no doubt about it. It makes sense, but we need time to establish a concrete connection. It's the only possible explanation," she muttered. Edelgard looked toward the stage at Constance, who was now staring longingly towards the blackened curtains on the side of the stage. "And I intend to ask the last Novelli about it. I can't say that's really a good idea. Edelgard walked forward, the heavy clanking of her metal boots interrupting Constance's speech. She took 3 steps toward Constance, before an unrecognizable object crashed to the ground a few feet in front of her. She instinctively flinched back, but did not raise her hallux as the woman turned to look at her. "Can I not have a soliloquy in peace?" Constance screeched. The Queen of Flames remained unfazed. "I simply wish to talk," Edelgard began. "You who would desecrate this laboratory, have the gall to talk." Constance ripped a chunk out of the wooden floor that made up the stage, raising it above her head in a ball of decayed wood and steel. Her hand was raised high above her head as green energy pulsed from her fingertips, ready to bring it down at a moment's notice. Edelgard stood her ground, unmoving, though the fingers wrapped around her hallux clenched even harder. "There is nothing here but the stench of decay." "Then why," Constance accused, jabbing a finger at her, "are you back? Did I not drive you and your motley band into the depths of the abyss?" She seemed slightly more sane for some reason. "I came to save you, of course. You unhappy dash." "Don't," the woman growled. "Don't mention her name." Edelgard held up her hands in defeat. "Fine. You were taken here against your will, were you not? Wouldn't you want to leave?" "The other me might have," she said quietly. "And what is this other me you speak of?" "She's gone. I haven't seen sunlight in years," she said wistfully. "I feel her influence creeping in sometimes, when the madness subsides." "Constance is crazy," Lysithea hissed. "Take her down, before she regains her wits." Edelgard did not move. "And yet you remain trapped here, turning on your would-be saviors." "Saviors? You're mistaken. His Majesty promised the restoration of House Novelli. What can you promise me?" "Did he order it himself?" Edelgard interrogated. "Or did his subordinate say that?" Constance looked lost in thought for a moment, before she regained her composure. "Whoever said it doesn't matter. You don't understand," she said, frost creeping into her tone. Nobody understands. I lost it all. Everyone. The only way to restore my honor is by my hand and my hand alone." "Your honor? What honor is there in being a lab rat?" "It seems you are misled," replied Constance coolly. "Those tensors were of my own design. The experiments merely unlocked my potential. Now I have the power to make whatever I want into reality." Could she have offered herself up out of her own free will? No, that wasn't possible. It couldn't be. It couldn't be. "You could do so much more," she offered, holding out her armored hand in a gesture of good faith. "Not as a slave to the magistrate, desperately clinging on to the vain pedigree of House Novelli, but as Constance." Why cling on to the past? She of all people knew that to be true. "Perhaps," Constance sighed. "You are right that I have no love for the magistrate and their ridiculous lines of inquiry. Neither do I have any love for Happy's blood experimentation. But where would I go? The surface, whose rays haunt my very nightmares with their blinding light. The abyss, to be hunted down for the rest of my days as a rat. No. If it is to be a prison, then I choose a prison of my own making." "Your mother's making, you mean?" She regretted saying those words as soon as they came out of her mouth. "Mother. Mother." Constance became visibly agitated, and her hands began shaking. "She knew, she did this to protect me. She'd never send me here, and yet she sent so many others. So her mother greenlit the experimentation of children to keep her own child unharmed." Edelgard thought. Well, she wasn't exactly surprised. Nobles tended to do that sort of thing. Without even moving her hands, objects all around the auditorium began to rise slightly, levitating off the ground and pulsing with a faint hue of green. Somehow the tensors were responding to her emotions as well, and considering her emotions were all over the place, it certainly did not bode well for the Queen of Flames. "I can't. I must protect," she groaned out. "The only thing left of House Novelli. Goddess damn it." Whether it was the augmentations, her family's tragedy, or even her own addled mind, Constance was broken. In those brief lapses of sanity Edelgard might have been able to sway her to the side of rebellion, but it was clear that anything would set her off. She might have promised Yuri to bring her back in one piece, but she soon found her regretting that promise in the heat of the moment. "Constance," she shouted, watching as the madness took hold. "Get a grip dash." Instantly a chunk of flooring slammed into her chest, knocking her backwards and onto her rear. She was able to brush it off rather quickly, feeling the impact of the landing in her lower body as she snapped upwards. Her hallux remained firmly in her grasp, ready to be raised at a moment's notice. But Constance hadn't moved. "It doesn't matter," she said, a tear rolling down her cheek. But she quickly wiped it off her face, and whatever softness had been in her expression vanished as her lips formed a determined grimace. "I must restore House Novelli. I must, I must, I must, I must. And if it means purging you and your filth from this place, just as I did to my security escort, then so be it." Shield recharge complete, her suit hummed. "Oh," Lysithea muttered. Edelgard switched to a fighting stance, flaring her hallux back to life. Red illuminated the darkened rows of the auditorium, amongst the rubble and destroyed seating. Before her, Constance von Novelli continued to hover with an otherworldly beauty, as random objects around the room fell and lifted themselves back up off the floor. With her gloves she made intricate gestures that left green energy trails behind, latching onto scattered pieces of debris and lifting them into a storm of objects that swirled around her head. The only exit from the auditorium was behind Edelgard, and she was not planning on running away anytime soon. And as the first of the objects sailed toward her own head, she braced herself for what was to come. "So much for diplomacy. I scarcely recognized you, with that dye you put in your hair. My apologies, Princess Edelgard." Edelgard bristled slightly at the remark. She had always been a little conscious of her hair, striking as it now was. She could not deny that it had a strange ethereal beauty to it, but it was not hers. It was theirs. The monsters that had created her, just like the rest of her body, it belonged to them. No longer was she little mousy brown-haired Elle, the one that Constance no doubt remembered from her days as the Novelli heir whenever she attended social gatherings. But she could not let it get to her. "It's been many years, Constance. I'm glad to see the Novelli house is alive and well." "Alive," Constance said. "But not well, no. Not when I am shackled underground, as the vermin and rabble laugh at my house's name." "I see your liveliness has not changed," Edelgard said coldly. "But now that you're here, things can change." There was a certain glimmer in the wide eyes of Constance von Novelli that she had not seen before. Perhaps it was the faintest sense of hope that she had, tantalizing, and yet so far out of reach. Here was the last remaining member of the once great House Novelli, reduced to nothing more than a hidden sorceress festering underneath Gareg Mach. But she was not broken. Not yet, at least. The abyss of Gareg Mach held a great deal of secrets, as she found out earlier that day as a result of the House leader's ill-fated expedition. Of course, its existence was a closely guarded secret in of itself, one that she was already privy to as a result of Juritsaw's wandering. The fact that the downtrodden, the exiled, and the forgotten were rotting beneath the center of Fodlan's power in a giant underground chasm angered her. The accursed archbishop let it fester, a gaping wound in the earth hidden by opulence and false promises of religion. And of course the underground itself bothered her. They reminded Edelgard far too much of the time she spent trapped beneath the earth, with scarcely a candle to light her cell with. The air was stale here, just as it had been in the dungeons. Those memories would never fade, and the nightmares remained as well. So that was how Edelgard was trapped inside the shadow library of Abyss, cornered by one incredibly persistent Constance von Novelli and by a wall of books. The dress she was wearing was a far cry from the silken fabric and opulent colors of her old house, black draped over white with a few knickknacks attached to her side. But unlike the rest of Abyss, it remained immaculate, some sort of magical spell, she supposed. And Constance herself was as pretty as ever, with her perfectly styled curls and unblemished face. The only sign that something was wrong was the hint of bags underneath her bright blue eyes. Edelgard was sure that if she asked, Constance would dismiss it as a result of too many sleepless nights pursuing the mysteries of magic. But her sunken eye sockets told a different story. Constance had lost something irreplaceable, gone with the rest of her family. Pity. That was what Edelgard felt. That, and irritation. If you're asking about your lost house, Edelgard said, putting a hand to her forehead in annoyance, there isn't much I can do. I'm just a student of the Officers' Academy right now. Oh, it doesn't have to be right at this instant. Constance chirped. I just trust that you can help with my, predicament. Well, one of them, at least. And there it was again with the house nonsense. She supposed that it was Constance's way of coping with the loss of her entire family. To restore their honor was a goal, something that she could fix her mind on and work towards. But to restore the ones she loved? Well, unless she invented necromancy, it certainly would never happen. Edelgard coped in her own way. She seethed silently, bore the insults that those who slither in the dark threw her way, swallowed her pride and laid plans for the future. She could not be as brash or as unapologetic as Constance she could not afford to. And here was another possible ally against Thales and his ilk, one who could perhaps match Hubert in magical skill. She, too, had lost in her own way, and Edelgard found that she could not simply turn her back on another survivor. But if the cost was undergoing the Herculean effort to restore House Novelli, then she would have to first judge if it was a price worth paying. You know how House Novelli was founded, right? Edelgard said, her hand finding a worn-out book on the shelf as Constance watched her. She grabbed it and began to leaf through absent-mindedly. Of course. I would not be a noble if I did not know the exact principles that my house was founded on. In 721, Camus Novelli earned a royal title by holding a wooden bridge single-handedly against the Dodon invaders. I think he was my great-great-great-great dash. I expected no less from you, Edelgard replied, cutting her off. But do you know what he lost in that battle? He lost an arm, Constance recalled. Exactly. He paid the price to save his legion, and for that he was handsomely rewarded. Her expression turned stern, staring directly into Constance's eyes. I cannot promise anything for your house. Not here, not now. But if you are willing to give all that you have for the sake of others, just as Camus von Novelli did, then I have no doubt that the future will have much in store for you, and by extension the Novelli name. So that's a yes. Constance said. Edelgard blinked twice in confusion. I beg your pardon. All I need to do is prove my worth, and House Novelli can be restored, right? She buried her face in her hands. That's not what I meant, but... Then you have to see it. Constance decried. My newest spell. Why, the songstresses will tell tales of my breakthroughs in magic. Before she knew it, she was being dragged out of the library and towards a sketchy corridor. She dropped her book in surprise onto the floor, and she made a mental note to return here in order to fix it. Or she could ask Hubert to do it. Either worked. It didn't take long for Constance to drag her into a small room filled with beakers, paper, and some magical sigils etched into the oak table in the center. There were also a disturbingly large amount of burns scattered across the table and the walls. Edelgard absent-mindedly wondered if she would make it out alive. Certainly the brigands that she had torn through earlier in the day could not compare to the dread she felt as Constance readied her spell. Feast your eyes, Constance said, on the magnificent magic of House Novelli. She did a twirl with her dress, letting the fabric settle onto the floor below, and then her outstretched fingers began to light up with the telltale signs of magic. It took all of Edelgard's etiquette training to not roll her eyes in the moment. Goddess damn it, not now! Edelgard yelled. What? Lysathea shouted over the line. Nothing. Edelgard twisted her body to the left in order to dodge a sheet of metal that would have cleaved her in two. She vaulted forward and remained on the offensive, gaining ground inch by inch as she dodged what she could and blocked anything that she could not. It seemed that Constance was starting to get a little creative. Besides throwing objects at her, the floor was not safe from being ripped up underneath her boots, and the already damaged ceiling now rained bits of rock from above. Slowly but surely the room began to look more like a scrapyard than the auditorium it was supposed to be. Constance's cackle rippled through the room and echoed across the fractured walls, haunting yet with a hint of her haughty arrogance. She was still out of reach, hovering on the stage as a maelstrom of old rebar and tile swirled in the air above her head. There was at least the hope that she would tire or grow careless, but Edelgard still could not find an opening in spite of her enhanced perception. All she could do was leap forward as the floor buckled beneath her, rising up in jagged spikes and shards to cut her down. She had seen a glimpse of another life. One where their reunion was far more amicable, still distant, buried beneath years of trauma and suffering between the two of them, but with a glimmer of hope underneath. But this was something else entirely. It was unfortunate that she did not have the time nor mental capacity to process what she had just seen. "Persistent, aren't you?" Constance taunted. Whatever bit of sanity she regained in the auditorium was gone, replaced by madness and a sadistic streak a mile wide. A massive chunk of concrete ceiling hurtled toward Edelgard, and she barely had time to cleave it in two with her axe before the next barrage came. It was all she could do to move out of the way in time. Nimble footwork and fast reactions could only bring her so far. It would only take a single stray sliver of metal moving fast enough to cripple her. Edelgard had to make a move. Blindly rushing forward, she broke out into an all-out sprint as she disengaged her hollow shield momentarily. A metal beam shot past her right side as she quickly turned her body sideways, still barreling down the remains of an aisle filled with broken planks of wood and steel seating. Constance was still outside of striking range, but she had managed to close the distance from a few dozen meters to in the single digits. Her opponent shouted in defiance, ripping the concrete beneath Edelgard's feet upward in an attempt to knock her off her feet. She used the opportunity to vault off of it, soaring through the air before tumbling down to the earth and back onto her feet. Where she had landed, a piece of the ceiling fell towards her, and Edelgard managed to block it in time as she reactivated her hollow shield and raised it above her head. A steel rod shot toward her chest, aiming true for the heart. She had no choice but to take the hit, and Edelgard chose to twist her body so that it would hit her in the shoulder. Pain shot through her body as the rod hit her suit, piercing through the metal plating and partially into her left shoulder. But she gritted her teeth and pressed on, batting away a few more projectiles as she continued to charge towards the stage. Now it was Constance's turn to panic. Seeing that even the most deadly of her projectiles only slowed the Queen of Flames down momentarily, she began waving her arms around in grand gestures to bring as much raw material into the air as possible. The tensors responded, tendrils of light emanating from her fingertips and lifting the rubble in the air. She only had moments before Constance threw the entire mass at her. Then she had an idea. A dumb idea, but an idea nonetheless. Edelgard extended her left arm and mimed pulling a trigger with her left hand, activating the grappling hook that ran from her wrist through her body. Firing outwards, it locked onto the side of the stage, embedding its steel hooks into the softer wood. And with a shout, she released her trigger finger so that the hook now retracted at full speed. But since it was stuck inside the stage, it had the effect of pulling her along with it, shooting her towards the stage as she used the momentum to break into another sprint. She was so close. But Constance was prepared. With a grin, she released the mass that was hovering above her head, letting it clatter to the ground beside her. The impact shook the entire auditorium, dust raining from the ceiling as cracks began to form. But now that her hand was free, she ripped the chunk of wood that the hook was embedded in out of the stage and toward Edelgard. She cursed as her momentum continued, but the hook was still retracting. Unable to adjust to the sudden change of velocity, she tumbled to the ground in an awkward roll, getting to her feet in an instant. She tried to curl her middle finger as fast as possible to deactivate the hook, but it remained firmly embedded. And before Edelgard could do anything about it, the chunk of wood came hurtling toward her and hit her squarely in the chest. In an instant, Edelgard was knocked to the ground as the wind had been taken out of her sails. Her breath caught in her throat, and though the impact had mostly been absorbed by her breastplate, it was enough to leave a nasty bruise and disrupt her line of attack. It was then that Constance brought the mass of metal and tile alike into the air and sent it hurtling at Edelgard. Still kneeling on the ground with one hand pushing herself up, all she could do was activate her hollow shield and raise her left arm so that it would block the brunt of the impact. Her shield shattered into red glass-like shards as soon as the mass made contact. A decent amount of material was deflected on impact, but the chunks that remained hit Edelgard's armor at a high velocity. She yelled in pain and in defiance as rubble rained down upon her, hitting her as she struggled to remain kneeling. Armor integrity compromised. "Your vitals are dropping," shouted a distant voice into her ear. Staggering to her feet, a cursory glance told her that a decent amount of her suit was damaged. There were dents and nicks all over her armor, and where the edge of the rubble was sharp, blood trickled out of her suit from small wounds all over her arms and chest. Edelgard was lucky that her hollow shield had taken the brunt of the impact, but as the cartridge popped out of her left gauntlet, it was clear that she could not take much more of this. Another solid mass was hurled at her, and this time she cleaved it in two with her hallocks. The force of her strike sent both halves clattering to the ground, and with every ounce of willpower she had remaining she leapt off of the broken ground and towards the stage, where Constance von Novelli was waiting. She landed on the stage with a thump, both feet landing firmly on the wooden stage. Immediately she rushed in and swung at Constance, who merely dodged backwards as she floated through the air. Another steel rod came at her, but this time, with her free left hand she caught it, fingers firmly curling around it as it threatened to shoot out of her grip. Constance responded by forcing the steel rod towards Edelgard's visor, but now that she was making contact with it, the vibration inducer in her suit made it difficult for her opponent to lock on properly. It took a few moments for it to stop moving, and she discarded it without a second thought. The next axe swing was towards Constance's torso. This she did not dodge, but instead erected a barrier of concrete pulled from the objects swirling around her head. It shattered as her axe made impact, but it was enough for Constance to shoot to the left and dodge her swing. "If you push her into a corner, then she can't escape," buzzed Lysithea over the comms. "Keep at it." "I know," growled Edelgard through gritted teeth. It was a delicate dance between the two of them. Emerald and crimson light flared through the room as Edelgard swung and swung, only to find that her target was out of reach and retaliating with all she had. Constance always had another trick up her sleeve, whether it was pulling down a chunk of the ceiling or deflecting her swings with pieces of metal and concrete. The fact that she was a few millimeters off the ground did not help. Normally, Edelgard could hope to trip her up with a low sweep of her leg or knock her off balance and deliver a killing blow. But it only took Constance a single small shift in her position to dodge any one of Edelgard's axe strikes. However, that was just what she was counting on. For one, it was forcing her towards the back of the stage, shrouded in darkness where the spotlight did not reach. And two, it meant that she was focusing more on dodging and blocking than actually attacking Edelgard. She did not want to take another hit. The plates of her armor were already damaged, and her joints were bruised and bloody from where the rubble had hit her before. "Queen," a voice hissed over a separate line, the one established by Berling to direct her mercenaries. It wasn't Berling, the voice was too masculine for that. It could only be Shay. "Not now," Lysithea hissed. "She's in the middle of engaging the target dash." "There's death squads inbound," he shouted. "We've barricaded ourselves in, but it won't hold for very long." Edelgard's breath caught in her throat as she barely managed to dodge a projectile headed straight for her visor, carving out a groove in the metal covering the side of her face. Lysithea must have been managing it alongside Captain Berling, she realized. No doubt she would have known before anybody else, and Yuri was clearly too occupied to care. And there was a good reason for not telling Edelgard as well. It would be a distraction that could potentially prove deadly for her. She could not manage a band of mercenaries while fighting off a savant with the power of gravity manipulation. She might have been enhanced, but she was still human. Death squads. Shay was blunt and not the most eloquent, but she understood what the young mercenary meant. Enforcers were one thing, and Legion soldiers were another. But there were the men with unmarked uniforms that carried out the wet work for the magistrate, whose bodies now littered the facility. They were brutally efficient and trained in all manner of stealth, something that did not excite her in the slightest. She would only have to hope that Berling's command would be enough. "Fuck," cut in another voice, and this time Edelgard could tell it was Berling. The outburst was enough to distract Edelgard momentarily, and she found herself being hit in the left of her greaves by a pebble. But it was fast enough that it might as well have been an antiquated bullet, and so it embedded itself firmly in the metal while forcing her leg backward from the impact. As she struggled to regain her balance, Berling continued. "We don't have time, Queen of Flames. We need to finish off Constance now. I'm moving in to help dash." "Negative," she managed to get out through gritted teeth. "You'd only be in the way." "Are you shitting me, dash?" Behind Edelgard, a distant explosion rumbled the earth, and she knew that there was not much time. Constance noticed, pulling backwards and giving Edelgard some much-needed breathing room. But the raging storm of rubble still swirled around her, and her raised hand made it clear that it was only a temporary reprieve. That's an order, Edelgard growled. Attend to your men, Captain. There was a series of rapid curses before the line clicked off. Stubborn, Lysithea muttered. In her mind's eye she saw the jaws of the trap slide shut. Constance on one end, the magistrate on the other, with no way out except death. And she was beginning to see the futility of fighting the woman. None of her attacks had even come close to scratching her, and unless she could attack Constance mentally there was no stopping her. How long are you going to keep this up? Constance shrieked. Don't you see that it's pointless? Just give up. The floor erupted from beneath Edelgard, planks shooting upwards and threatening to skewer her. She shouted in surprise and just barely managed to roll out of the way. And die already. She batted away another stray projectile. Even if you kill me, the magistrate is closing in. Do you think they'll just let you walk away? Don't you think I know that? So hurry up and die. We share a common enemy. Edelgard shouted, sliding backwards to give some distance between the two of them and coming up against the edge of the stage. This is a pointless fight. The only enemy I see here is you, she snarled. The magistrate is the only enemy that matters, Edelgard retorted. For all of Newfoundland. She scoffed. And what does the rest of Newfoundland matter to me? I was spit out, cast into the abyss as everything I ever knew turned to ash. They can burn for all I care. The ones who made you, like this, you'd let them get away with it. Constance's eyes flared for a second, hatred radiating from her as she seethed. Like this, you say? As if you think I am mad. Edelgard did not dare to answer that question. The madness had already taken hold of Constance von Novelli, and she did not know if it was a side effect of her augmentations, a trauma-based response, or that she had always been insane. She still did not understand why or what had been done to Constance, but it was clear that she needed to be stopped by any means necessary. No. My eyes have merely been opened, she said, the anger dissipating for a split second. In their foolishness they have given me power beyond measure, unlocking my mind in ways I never fathomed until they cut open my body. What more could I ask for from the magistrate? I was once a disgraced woman hiding from her past, with barely a penny to my name. Now I am so much more. She wouldn't. Whispered Lysithea. Edelgard's eyes widened beneath her visor, as she began to digest the ramifications of that statement. She had not been willing to accept it, but now she understood. Constance didn't need to be rescued. No, she was completely in control of the situation. You asked for this. You asked them to experiment on you so that you could make the tensors. A faint smile formed on her lips, though she could not hide the malice in her expression. Yes. She willingly gave up her free will in exchange for power. How could you? Edelgard launched into an attack, swinging her axe in a frenzy that only served to push Constance backwards. The first was dodged, the second was blocked by a makeshift shield of metal and rock, and the next few were deflected by a wave of her hand. They're monsters. Edelgard yelled. You let them experiment on you for this. Oh ho, looks like I struck a nerve. Who's the med one now? You're no better than they are. In her anger, her attacks were clumsy and telegraphed. Rage would not be the path to victory, and so Edelgard tried her best to recall better times, times when she could have considered herself happy. She tried to imagine the blue skies of Dusker, the Hresvelg villa's beautiful flowers, and the radiant expression of her own mother. But it was to no avail. The more she tried, the more she raged, and the flame inside her would not go out easily. The ferocity of her attacks only increased with her rage, and soon Constance found herself being overwhelmed. She might have been able to react to the attacks with impunity, but when several swipes and cleaving strikes were strung together with wild unpredictability, even she could not dodge them all. You're overexerting yourself. Edelgard heard someone yell into her ear, Lysithea perhaps, but it was nothing more than a buzzing in her ringing ears. Edelgard charged through a makeshift barrier before swinging her blade directly at Constance's face. She no longer had space to maneuver, and the only thing holding Edelgard back was a chunk of concrete and metal, pressed up against the glowing crimson of her hallux. Constance's face turned to a grimace as she strained with effort, holding out both hands in a futile attempt to keep the integrity of her shield as Edelgard's blade threatened to slice through. Green clashed with red in flashes of energy, lighting up the darkened stage and pressing Constance further against the wall. And when her barrier did give way, she only barely managed to slink to the side and dodge as the ash came crashing down to the floor. But Edelgard was nothing but crafty, and so right as the barrier cracked in two and fell harmlessly to the floor, she threw the dagger that Dima had given her so many years ago. Normally it merely hung at her side as an ornament, but it was only now that she had an opportunity to strike. It was a seamless motion, grabbing the blade from her utility belt where it hung and then throwing it with all the precision of a master assassin. It soared through the air for a moment, and Constance seemed to panic. Constance shrieked as she tried to redirect it, but it was too late. It might have been aimed at her chest, but the small amount of deflection meant that it embedded firmly into her right arm slightly below the shoulder. Where it had struck, a small stream of blood trickled down her arm, falling to the ground and splattering it with red. Plip, plip. She mentally patted herself on the back for the direct hit. It was the first real blow Constance had taken, and it was proof that she was in fact not invulnerable. She was flesh and blood just as the rest of them were, and all it required was a little bit of trickery. But she did not know if it was by luck or by skill that she drew blood from Constance, and now there was only one way to find out as she geared up to attack again. Constance's right arm hung limply at her side. But her left, however, remained operational. Her expression could only be described as indiscriminate rage, as her facial features contorted into a twisted sneer through gritted teeth. She began to rise into the air, higher and higher until she was hovering over Edelgard's head. Of course, the Queen of Flames did not sit by idly. She swung upwards in a wide arc, hoping to at least distract her from flying further upwards. But it had no effect as she merely moved out of the way. "Queen," the operator yelled. "Berling's team is being overrun." But she did not care in the heat of the moment. Or more accurately, she did not have the luxury of caring. Now Constance braced her right arm with her left. Where her wound was, she applied pressure to her right bicep to try to staunch the bleeding that trickled down her arm and onto her dress. She stretched her hand out palm first, and at first Edelgard thought she was calling for her to stop. Then, as the stage churned beneath her, she realized what was going on far too late to do anything about it. The floor around Edelgard rose upwards, each board and plank rising upwards and surrounding her on all sides. But her feet remained on solid ground, and by the time she realized she had to jump, her path was already blocked by stiff walls shooting up toward the ceiling. Constance reached further to grab even the concrete and metal framework the stage was attached to, ripping them up into what seemed like fingers of a massive hand. And that meant that she had to be in the palm of Constance's hand. But it was too little, too late, and no matter how much she whacked at the solid mass surrounding her with her hollowks, it barely budged. "I'm about to be crushed," she realized dimly. She almost laughed at the absurdity of the situation. Here she was, the leader of the rebellion against the magistrate, about to be killed by a mad noblewoman by means of suffocation. Constance turned her hand so that her palm faced upwards in a claw gesture. Then she closed her hand in a fist and the earth closed around Edelgard. From all sides Edelgard felt herself being crushed as the mass surrounded her. Rubble and wood alike churned as the vice grip closed, completely surrounding Edelgard and now threatening to crush her body. It wasn't long before she was wrapped in tendrils of junk and rubble, all pulling inward toward one another and crushing her between them. She felt her feet being lifted off the floor as the mass enveloped her body, pressing against her armor as she felt the armored plating crack like a glass bottle. And even though the vibration inducer on her chest was desperately trying to activate, it could not possibly vibrate a mass this large, and so her body felt the familiar feeling of being manipulated like a marionette. Constance was fully in control now. "I can't die here," Edelgard thought. Not again, not trapped in an enclosed space, suffocating in the darkness as she waited for the sweet release of death. She still had so much to live for. And as Constance squeezed and squeezed, she found herself screaming in pain as her ribs cracked and her visor shattered. She was trapped here, cocooned in a prison of metal and rock, crushing her beneath what seemed like the weight of 1,000 stars as the grip grew tighter and tighter. All Edelgard could do was scream in pain, and in the distance she heard the haughty cackle of a woman who had won. Chapter 40, Interlude, The Ashen Wolves. Wanted. The man known as the Savage Mockingbird is wanted for 5 counts of racketeering, 17 counts of extortion, 1 count of grand larceny, 2 counts of armed robbery, and 7 counts of first-degree murder. The savage mockingbird is wanted on suspicion of being an underground crime boss in District Number 46, most notably for his attack on several research facilities owned by Robotics Heavering Industries. He is rumored to frequent some of the drinking establishments in District Number 46, along with the tunnels leading outside of the district. He is described as having a fair complexion and a relatively skinny build, no more than 5'7" in height, though no reports of his face have been verified. Approach with extreme caution. Any information leading to his arrest can result in a monetary award of more than 100,000 credits from your local enforcer station. An excerpt from a police transmission titled, Newfoundland's Most Wanted. What do you dream about, Yuri Bird? Happy lazily stretched her feet out on the sofa, uncurling with the telltale signs of drowsiness. It wasn't exactly a luxury. Couch time had taken its toll on the black leather, leaving it ripped in multiple places with the stitching showing. And the stains he had taken far too much time to wash out. The mysterious blotches of faded color scattered around the cushions, though some of them still remained as pale imitations of what they once were. And that was what they were, the Ashen Wolves, at least. It was a moniker that had come from the wolf pelt hanging on the house walls, a relic from the old owner that they had not bothered to put away. Not that there were many wolves left in Newfoundland outside of the city outskirts. There was far too much irradiated land for wildlife to thrive. This one, however, was old as shown by the decaying matted fur and the patches of missing hair on it. Its beady black eyes, preserved by the old ways of taxidermy, still glared at each and every passerby with the ferocity that it had when it was alive. A few bounties had been enough to put the 4 of them in a cheap love hotel for perpetuity. A few good heists had been enough to buy them this decrepit old house. Perhaps a few good murders would be enough to buy them a building or two. But for now, their hands remained relatively unsullied, though his own had been besmirched a long time ago. He was acutely aware that he was merely waxing poetic to dodge the question Dear Happy had posed to him. His mother had once asked him the same question, and he had merely answered that he wanted his mother to live comfortably. It would have been silly anywhere else in Newfoundland, but it was not guaranteed in the outskirts of the city. With every drop of blood that stained his hands, it was one step closer to making his childish dream a reality. Now, however, he could not answer. Yuri said, placing his chin in his hand. I'm not very sure myself. But Constance and Balthus know, Happy pointed out. She never shuts up about the whole restoration of House Novelli nonsense. Not to mention she's a physics prodigy. I still have no idea what she writes down on the chalkboard sometimes. And Balthus just wants to drink and flirt, he countered. The king of grappling doesn't have ambitions. Why should I? It's nice to dream. He raised an eyebrow at that. If you're asking me, then what about you? Surely if you insist that I have a dream in mind, then you must as well. Nuh-uh. You first. Yuri rolled his eyes. Fine, he said, sighing before clearing his throat. I'd like to make the abyss a better place, for one. We're not exactly in a place to negotiate with the powers that be, not to mention cleaning up the streets. All sorts of bastards think they can get away with whatever they want down here just because the magistrate turns a blind eye. I want to fix that. Sounds like a royal pain in the ass, she muttered. Even if it's a good goal. What, you don't want to make things down here better? It's fine. Not good, not bad. Just fine. You sleep all day, Happy. You wouldn't know if it was good or bad. I sleep for 50% of the day, she retorted. That's a big difference. Whatever. Point is, he said, no one else is doing it. Thus it falls on us, the Ashen Wolves, to figure it out. And I don't suppose our great leader has a plan. He smirked. Of course. So you don't have a plan. She held up her hands in defeat. Well, I guess if you get yourself killed trying to change things, then at least it was for a noble cause. Happy. She had seen right through him. Of course he didn't have a long-term plan. He worked in missions and networks, not a grand design to change the world. That was something he was wholly unprepared for. But it was nice to think about from time to time, and the day might come where he would be ready to make waves. What, she said with a hint of disdain. Just pointing out the obvious. Fine. Then you spill. Isn't obvious, she replied. I want to see the world. The world. The rest of Newfoundland, dummy. Not my fault I got kidnapped and trapped in the abyss. And whose fault was it, he said, exasperated, that you decided to run away from home as a teenager? With nothing to defend yourself, mind you. You're lucky that you're even alive. I knew it would all work out in the end. He raised an eyebrow. And you're still just as naive, now that you're stuck here. I just knew. Exasperated, Yuri slouched further into his own chair. You are absolutely exhausting and infuriating in equal measure. But it's not a bad dream. My parents took up astronomy as a hobby, she wistfully recalled. They made a telescope out of spare parts, and I would gaze at the stars through the dirty lens, hoping that one day I might see them for myself. I've always yearned to explore the universe, Yuri Bird. But I know that I'll probably be stuck in Newfoundland for the rest of my life, and it hurts to think about it. That was awfully poetic, especially for you. She shrugged. I think Constance's horseshit soliloquies rubbed off on me. So you'll leave us, then? Maybe. Well, not until my savings account has a few more zeros, she said, grinning a cat-like smile. And the animals come with me. There is no way you are taking Larry to see the world. And just as the words slipped off his tongue, Yuri caught a glimpse of the cat in question slinking through the hallways, its small black form casting a shadow amidst the dusty floorboards. Something about that rubbed him the wrong way, and he recalled an old superstition that his mother had once told him. But he paid it no attention for now, and instead rolled his eyes. Well, I think we all deserve to be happy, right? Happy said. But for now, I think I like it here. I'm not bored of it just yet. I'm glad you aren't thinking of leaving us just yet, he replied. Though, what if the right opportunity presents itself? Then the day will come when this hatchling spreads her wings, and soars on her own. Yuri chuckled. You took that straight out of Constance's mouth, didn't you? Happy snorted. It was from a book. I thought it sounded nice. The real world is nothing like the books you read. But a girl can dream, can't she? Now let's discuss the real important questions like, what flavor of ice cream we're buying this month. Yuri's eyes practically rolled back into his skull. Out of all the Ashen Wolves, Happy had the least common sense, and so it was no surprise that she was asking about ice cream of all things when they were barely able to pay rent for the month. I am perfectly happy in my current living conditions. Constance protested. I cannot say the same for whatever lies in Fherdiad. So what is the point of accepting? What's the point? What happened to the noble girl I found in the tunnels of Abyss, ranting and rambling about restoring her fallen house? Yuri countered. Have you just become content to languish here, forgotten except for a few scribbles on the wall here and there? How dare you dash? She jabbed a perfectly manicured finger in the direction of Yuri's face. You and I both know, he said, quietly brushing off the dust on an old desk, that there's nothing left for you here. He turned so that she could not see the anger etched into the creases on his face and the sadness in his eyes. But you and Balthus are here, Constance whispered. The haughtiness that she carried herself with had vanished in an instant. What happened to never leaving one of us behind? You would never. What makes this situation any different? Constance, Yuri said, a hint of anger flaring in his voice. This is the Fherdiad School of Science we're talking about. State-of-the-art research facility. The opportunity to learn from Newfoundland's best and brightest. Hell, even the demmed dining hall has to be magnitudes better than the slop we get served here. The fucking opportunities you and Happy will have there, why, I can't even begin to imagine dash. She sighed. Neither can I possibly fathom what they want with a disgraced girl like me. Perhaps they see talent in the two of us. Or more likely, we're to be paraded and shown off as proof that the Abyss really does produce miracles. There must be some ulterior motive to this. Or maybe they want to offer you two an opportunity of a lifetime. You and I both know that opportunities like this never come without strings attached. But it's the only opportunity you have. Constance stared at him, their eyes briefly locking before she averted her gaze. Was it out of embarrassment? No, that only worked with women he could charm, and there was no amount of charm or guile that worked on Constance von Novelli. It was guilt, languishing behind a pair of cold eyes. Yuri, she said quietly. Perhaps I am content with being here. With you. With the Ashen Wolves. We can stir up some mayhem, get chased by enforcers again like the old days. I can continue my research with Happy by my side, maybe even find a way to cure Balthus and his hangovers. And I can do it all from here. Content, yes. But are you happy? She paused for a second, and that was all the confirmation he needed. I don't know, she whispered. I don't recall what it means to be happy. Constance put her hand on the table to steady herself, and Yuri matched it with one of his own on top of hers. You, she continued. You all gave me purpose. I find it difficult to imagine a life worth living without the Ashen Wolves together, fighting the good fight as you would call it. Staying is the only choice I can imagine. If you stayed here, Yuri replied. I could never forgive myself. Why? Me and Balthus, well, we're not exactly the sharpest tools in the shed. I might be witty, yes, and Balthus is a hunk of meat with muscles for brains. But you two. He looked back to see Happy dozing off on a couch right outside the door, a small bit of drool rolling down her chin. You two are fucking geniuses, if you'll pardon my Almiron. With the right support, you could finally prove your theories about gravity manipulation. You could find proof of the circumvention of the first law of thermodynamics. Happy can publish her research on blood transformation and recreation. You could change the world as we know it. Is that not what the Ashen Wolves set out to do? Constance inquired. Change the world for the better, I mean. You mean change the abyss, huh? Maybe. We might be able to make a meaningful change here after a decade or so, he admitted. Not like it matters, considering it's so small scale. They need our help, she stubbornly insisted. And that's why Balthus and I are staying. We have no future outside of here, no magic opportunity to whisk us away to the surface, no dream to chase. But you do have a dream. He leaned forward in the rocking chair he was sitting on, until it was at the very precipice of tipping forward. That's why every time I see you and Happy, I feel guilty. That I'm keeping you from the world, that your brilliance is being snuffed out by the apathy and decay of abyss. And a part of me prays to the goddess that you might not be here the next time I wake, and that you two have left in order to pursue your dreams and carve your own legacy. Yuri, she shouted. How could you say such a thing? You want me to leave? Yeah, no shit. After all we've been through, all we've bled for, all that we've almost died for. He sighed. I know. You still want me to leave? Yes. She rocked back and forth, wrapping her arms around her knees to make herself look smaller. Admit it, Constance. Chasing after dealers and stealing from gangs isn't going to change the fucking world. You aren't changing anything, much less restoring your house to glory by rotting down here. So why? I don't want to be left alone again, she whispered. I can't lose you guys. He smiled sadly. You'll have Happy. She'll follow you to the ends of the earth if need be. Look, he said, shrugging. There are people who would kill for the opportunity that's just landed in your lap, and you would be a fool to not take it. I have always been a fool, Constance von Novelli muttered. But now, even more than ever. You know as well as I do that I hate admitting that you were right. But you were. It is time for Happy and I to cut our own path through the world. But I have no doubt that our paths will cross once again, and when they do so, I hope that we can welcome each other with open arms and a smile. Love, Constance von Novelli, he read. P.S. Do not forget to call me. Yuri rocked back and forth in his chair for a good while. The letter was penned in Constance's fancy handwriting in dark black ink on the finest paper that money could buy. He appreciated the personal touch, considering she could have just left a message and left. But it was not the same as a last goodbye in person. His only guess was that she did not have the heart to do so. And Yuri smiled. The two of them were destined for great things. Or so he hoped. The weight of what he had done still rested heavily on his heart, as did the forged documents sitting in his filing cabinets. It had been a Herculean effort on his part as the savage mockingbird, to bribe the necessary officials to take a look at their applications. Applications, of course, that he had sent itself. But he knew that their genius would not go unrecognized, and of course the Fhurdyad School of Science would not pass up on such a promising pair of young candidates. His holodeck buzzed. Yuri popped it open, only to find a short message from Happy. "Train ride sucks." He chuckled audibly. She had always been a carefree spirit, and just like Constance he could not stand to see the two of them cooped up underground. There was no ulterior motive, no great plan that he conjured up when he first decided to send their applications in for them. He merely wanted them to live happily, away from the constant life or death struggle beneath New Fodlan. And though it pained him greatly to see them leave, it was something that had to be done. At least he would have Balthus. The man was said to see them go, but even with that thick skull of his he agreed that their genius would be better suited in a place of research, where their talents could be nurtured and mentored. They were not fit for a life of violence and retaliation, they were far too bright for that. And, he thought to himself, they deserved a far better life considering what the two young women had gone through. It was too late for Yuri. He had wit and guile to spare, and perhaps he would have been able to cut it on the surface world, maybe even flourish in the cutthroat world of finance. But a life spent chasing money and power did not appeal to him in the slightest. He worked best in the shadows for a reason, and though at the moment he might have been chasing true power as the savage mockingbird, it was only a means to an end. Not until his mother could truly be safe and happy, and the abyss became a place to live rather than a place to embrace hedonism, until then, he would bathe his hands in blood. Balthus, too, was stuck in the quagmire of the abyss. Maybe he could have found fame in the pro wrestling circuit as his self-proclaimed title suggested, but he had no interest in anything beyond women and drink. He had no ambition, which was why Yuri trusted him more than anyone else. There was nothing for him on the surface, nothing other than a family that had abandoned him. No, the abyss was the place for the both of them, and he had quite a lot of unfinished business to sort out. And so they would languish in the darkness, while he could only hope that the two birds that he had set free would soar high into the sunny blue skies that eluded him. And for a time, they did. Or at least, he assumed so. Then one day, Happy and Constance simply dropped off the face of the planet, and no matter how hard he tried to search for them, they eluded his inquiries. It was as if they had never existed at all. Until now. "She's quite headstrong, isn't she?" Happy murmured once the call ended. There was silence. "Hello?" "Fodlan to Yuri," she snapped. He jolted out of his stupor and returned to form, his mind slipping out of the memories that had enthralled him. "Sorry," he muttered. "What were you saying?" "The Queen of Flames. She seems quite sure of herself." "It's an endearing flaw of hers," Yuri admitted. "Though one that tends to cause more trouble than it's worth." Yuri lazily adjusted his position on the couch, resting his feet on the glass table that separated the two. It seemed to be about the only thing that remained intact in Happy's little laboratory. The entire room was a mess of broken beakers, upturned furniture, and strange liquids pooling on the floor in odd patterns. Here was her little refuge, a small lounge area covered in worn books and torn candy bars. In a way, it almost reminded Yuri of their old hideout where they spent their days together. But they were no longer ashen wolves, and Yuri was no longer the bold mercenary he once was. He had been tempered by years of quiet, undone by the very peace he brokered as de facto lord of the underground. He was merely a bar owner and sometimes fixer if the right person asked. There was no going back to who he once was, even if he sometimes picked up a blade here and there. Happy was no longer the spunky street urchin who dreamed of the stars, either. She had always dreamed of making it big and changing the world with her ideas, and now she was a scientist in every sense of the word. Unfortunately, it seemed that a bit of sanity had also gone with her childlike innocence, and her bright optimism had turned to a cold apathy over the years. There was no going back to the past. There was only reconciling what they once had with what they had now. "I don't really like the magistrate," Happy said disdainfully. "Well, that's an understatement. But don't you think drawing all this attention to yourself is just such a bother? Fortune favors the bold, right?" She raised an eyebrow. "I used to say that. Not anymore. Come on, Happy. Look what they've done to you." He gestured around them, to the scattered wreckage of her research, and to the obvious frown on the girl before her. She was still as pretty as he remembered, but there was a weariness in her expression that could not be denied. Her white lab coat, or at least he assumed it had once been white, was stained with shades of violet and crimson, and the goggles perched on top of her forehead were half broken. It was difficult to reconcile her now with what she remembered of her, and though the face might have been the same, the mind and the soul were not. And so what? She put her hands behind her head, whistling a soft tune. Doesn't make me want to do anything about it. What if I said I liked it here? Happy, you and I both know that staying in this laboratory doesn't help anyone. Why not join us and fight? He looked down at his sheathed sword, and his finger twitched as if itching for blood. She frowned, as if realizing something. What happened to you? She muttered indignantly. You used to be all about keeping a low profile. Keeping your identity hidden. Now you want to challenge the magistrate directly. Did you grow a pair of balls or something? Me? And what the hell happened to you? He shouted, and a temper that had long been suppressed now rose up from within. I searched for you all these years, only to find you languishing in a laboratory afraid of your own shadow. And don't even get me started on the shady lady dash. Don't, Happy growled. He leaned back into the couch, wanting to sink into its soft leather and disappear. His momentary anger deflated, and his expression grew sorrowful. Neither of us can return to who we once were, she finished. Coco especially. How is she? Yuri asked neutrally. She scoffed at the inquiry. What is she, is probably the better question to ask. Once the magistrate sunk their teeth into her, it was all but over. Now she's just a puppet, dancing on their strings whether she knows it or not. Then why do you stay if it's a lost cause? He then tapped a finger to his head in a sarcastic manner. Oh, I know. Because no one else will. That's what you're going to say, isn't it? Fuck off, Yuri. Just because you wouldn't stay doesn't mean I would dash. Of course I would stay, he said quietly. Happy seemed visibly surprised, as the indignance scrawled all over her face now faded to a mere indifference, and perhaps there was a hint of sadness in her bright red eyes. If it meant rotting in the dungeons alongside her, I would do it for all eternity if it meant that Constance was safe. I just didn't know. I searched for years, he growled. And now I find the two of you rotting beneath a destroyed mountain as prisoners, and neither of you want to leave. It's really not that simple. I find it hard to believe that escape would be anything but. Yuri, Happy said quietly. Is it so hard to want to live in peace? What? He cocked his head at her. You can't call this peace. This is a prison, for the goddess's sake. I've seen the outside world, and it's not all that it's cracked up to be. Sometimes I wish that I had just stayed in my home district and never left. But there's no going back now, is there? Yuri said defiantly. You've seen the world for what it truly is. Now is your chance to change it. I tried once, she said bitterly. And look where it's gotten me. What? My theory on blood reconstruction using concentrated genetic material worked, Yuri Bird. It worked too well. And now I am to spend the rest of my days creating monsters from the injured and the dying. I was so eager to prove that I was right, she muttered, that I failed to recognize what I was doing was wrong. She looked at him with wide eyes, staring through him rather than at him. Was it so wrong to want to make the world a better place? We could have found a solution to the problem of aging, cured every disease that had ever ailed mankind. But instead, all they wanted were the monsters I made. He reached over to comfort her with a hand, a simple gesture that had been commonplace when they were still ashen wolves. But instead, she recoiled at his touch and jerked away. Sorry, he said sheepishly. I forget that things aren't how they used to be. Then remember it, asshole. Her eyes flared with anger, though it immediately dissipated in a matter of seconds. He bristled at that. Once she had been detached from the world, approaching every task with an air of quiet indifference. But now she was mercurial as the weather, shifting moods faster than he could keep up with. It was clear that being caged did not bode well for her, and he wondered if her spirit had been broken along with her mind. Suddenly, Yuri's communicator buzzed. Leclerc, a female voice hissed. It took a brief moment to identify who it was, before confirming that it was indeed the Golden Deer's operator. He knew nothing about Lysithea aside from her name and the rumor of her prowess. But it was enough to trust in her abilities, even if he did not trust her personally. "That's me," he said lazily, refusing to make eye contact with Happy while he talked. "I need you to get off your ass," she said dismissively. "There's a magistrate death squad coming in, fast. How long do we have?" "Maybe 10 minutes, tops." Yuri shut off the communicator and glared at the woman sitting across from him, cross-legged. If she had a reaction at all to that piece of information, she did not show it outwardly. The only thing left was her flat expression, devoid of any perceptible emotions. "Balthus," he yelled out with enough force to make Happy flinch. He heard heavy footsteps, before the doors practically flew off the hinges. A large man in plated armor ran through, covered in black and dark red grime. His eyes flickered to Yuri, before flickering to Happy, and then flickering back to Yuri once more. "What is it, boss?" he asked nonchalantly. "I thought you wanted to speak to Happy in private after our little reunion." "Sup, Happy," he added, waving. She did not respond in kind. "We've got a problem," Yuri replied. "No shit. I've already had our men take defensive positions around key choke points in the facility. Berling's team is backing us up once they finish collecting the data. We can buy you some time." "Not very much, though. I see someone's grown a bit smarter over the years," Happy remarked. "When did you get this responsible?" "Coming this close to fatherhood," he replied without missing a beat, "does that to a man." He pinched his fingers barely an inch apart from one another to signify the small margin. Her face morphed into one of disgust. "Never mind. You're just as much of a dog as you were before, B. Thanks." "Happy," Yuri said sternly, steering the flow of their conversation back to its original path. "You don't have much of a choice now, since the magistrate's closing in. Come with us." "Please." "I do have a choice," she replied coldly. "I can choose to do nothing. Sitting here and dying is not much of a choice. Either that, or they clap you and Constance in irons for the rest of your days, never to see the sun again. Is that what you want?" She shrugged. "Running, dying, it doesn't matter much to me. I have nothing to live for, anyway." "I know you're still alive because of Constance," he replied. "Is that not a reason to keep on fighting?" "Sure," she admitted. "But I wouldn't exactly call being here living." "So leave this place," Balthus offered. "Come work at Yuri's bar." "I'm surprised it's still open," she scoffed. "I'm impressed. Regardless, I think I'll respectfully pass on being one of his barmaids. Anything is better than being a prisoner. I would know that, considering all the times I've been thrown in jail." Yuri sighed in exasperation. "No one said you were gonna be a barmaid." He gave a pointed glare at Balthus, who merely shrugged and tapped the edge of his gauntlets on Yuri's couch. "But I just want to get you out of here." "And what about Constance?" she replied. "Are you going to kill her, then, while we flee to places unknown?" "What? Hell no!" Balthus shouted. Then he paused to look at Yuri. "Wait. You're not seriously considering that, right, boss?" "She's a danger," Yuri admitted. "But if we could sway her, then maybe." Happy remained still for a while, though her expression did not change. "What say we knock a little sense into her?" Balthus replied, holding up a fist. "Respectfully, of course. I would never strike a lady unless she was about to murder me. Constance would see you coming far before you got within striking distance. She is, not fully human anymore. And with the tensors, she could kill us all with a wave of her hand. It's pointless." The look of exasperation on her face was one that he had seen many times. It was the same that he had seen on the widows and orphans of Abyss, the ones that had been forgotten and left to rot by society. It was an expression of hopelessness. And yet. "But she hasn't killed you," Yuri realized. So there has to be something left of the woman I trusted with my life." He remembered seeing some of the footage that the Queen of Flames had given him, where Constance von Novelli was nothing more than a force of nature. She had the power and the intelligence to stop the most infamous renegade of their time with barely a flick of her wrist, and yet it seemed that it had come at the cost of her sanity. Perhaps she would have been better off dead, it was a thought that pained him. Still, As insane as she might have been, she had remained sane enough to stay her hand when it came to Happy. Of course, Yuri did not know if Happy was willing to actually talk her down from the precipice due to the fact that she was also a bit insane. He could only hope that if Constance still remembered Happy fondly, then there was a chance that the two men might be as well. He was gambling on the strength of their bonds as ashen wolves. But Yuri Leclerc had always been a gambler at heart, and so he knew what he had to do. Yuri shook his head. Balthus. We're going down. Are we knocking some sense into dainty little Constance, then? He replied wearily. Nah, she's not dainty. Ferocious is more like it. If we can't talk her down, then yes. He stood up, fingers tapping at the pommel of his sword. Happy, if you're not willing to help us, then so be it. But I'm willing to bet that there's a bit of our old friend left in there, and I won't leave until both of you are out of here. You'll die trying, she said dismissively. I'm sorry, Yuri. It's just not possible. Sorry for listening in, Lysithea interjected. But please put me through to the Happy lady. What? Yuri replied. I know you're trying to convince her. So put me through right this instant. Who's that? Happy asked, taken aback. He sighed. It couldn't hurt, could it? It angered him that there was an outsider listening in on their conversation, but he doubted that anything would sway Happy either way. An operator, he said dismissively. Fine. Say what you have to say, Lysithea. Happy and Balthus looked at each other briefly, but said nothing. Listen, lady, she growled. I think it's pathetic that you're refusing to stand up for yourself and do anything. I've seen the research data. You've been making fucking monsters for the magistrate. Do you have any idea just how much blood is on your hands? Yuri frowned. Where had this ferocity come from? It wasn't my intention to, Happy replied coldly. I don't care. You're just as responsible as the magistrate is, and now you want to lie down and die while your friends try to save the Novelli girl. I can't accept that. Not when so many less deserving people have died at their hands. Happy's expression turned dark. You don't get to lecture me about something you know nothing about. Not while you're sitting cushy in front of a screen, while we rot down here. I would be down there if I could, Lysithea said bitterly. Let's just say that Novelli and I are rather similar in our experiences with the magistrate. The room in the air turned cold, as the full implications of what the young operator had just said began to sink in. What? Never mind if it was true or not, why had she told them of all people? I don't care if you believe me, she continued brusquely. But I would tear Newfoundland down brick by brick if I could for what they've done to me. The fact that you won't do the same is, quite frankly, sad. She scoffed. What, you want me to pick up a sword and fight them? Fat chance I'd get anywhere besides an early grave. Doesn't mean you have to fight. I just want you to get off your fucking ass and do something about it. Starting with your friend. I wouldn't be here today if someone had given up on me, and the fact that you already have is just sad. I've already tried, Happy sighed. The thought is appreciated, but it's wasted. We can't win against the world. Then you clearly haven't tried enough. I learned long ago that winning requires sacrifice, Lysithea said bitterly. What are you willing to lose? Then the communication cut, leaving the three ashen wolves to stare in silence. Fuck, whispered Happy quietly. Yuri pondered the operator's words for a moment. The girl was shrewd, if not effective. She had been able to cut through Happy's apathy with her harsh words. And she was right, Yuri and Balthus were far too sentimental to reprimand their old friend like that. Giving up and dying, that was not something Yuri could come to terms with. It saddened him that Happy had merely given up. The once spunky runaway had been brought down to earth. Maybe, and just maybe, Lysithea's words had their intended effect. Whether she was telling the truth or not didn't matter. She had told Happy what she needed to hear, and that was that. And there was a hope in his heart that Constance could be swayed to their side, and that they would not need to kill her. He had killed far too many people in his line of work. All he had to do was save the fourth ashen wolf. He owed it to the woman, considering it had been him that had damned the two of them here in the first place. She had to be saved. But what was he willing to sacrifice? Balthus whistled. Damn. Girls got quite the lip. Lysithea's right. I would give my life for a chance to save you and Constance, Yuri declared. Balthus would, too. Right. His subordinate looked as if he was about to respond, but he shut his mouth before anything stupid could come out of his mouth. Would you not do the same for her? For your friend? Things aren't what they used to be, Happy muttered. It's not as simple as being there for her. I'd have to dash. Burling's team is being overrun, interrupted Lysithea over the comms. Either you move, or you all die. As if on cue, the ground shook. He had no idea if it was the magistrate blowing a hole in the side of the mountain, or Constance and the Queen going overboard. Either situation did not bode well for the three of them. Boss, we have to go, Balthus nudged him. He looked at Happy, who was frozen in thought and barely paying them any attention. Yuri hoped that the woman was thinking about making the right choice and joining them in their attempt to sway Constance, but there was no telling what was going on in her mind anymore. All he could do was pray to the goddess that her heart was in the right place. Whatever choice you make, Yuri said with as much conviction as we can muster, we'll be back for you. You say that things have changed, but no matter what I swear that you'll always be one of us, Happy. That's a promise. They locked eyes for a brief second, and he made an effort to commit her features to memory as he stared into her crimson eyes. Yuri still could not read her expression, aside from the twinkle of tears shimmering right beneath her pupils. She made no move to get up or to speak, just a quiet moment shared between the two of them, heavy with the things that remained unsaid. But then her eyes flickered away, and so he turned around with Balthus by his side and began to march toward the stairs leading downstairs. That was where the Queen of Flames and Constance were fighting, and it didn't seem to be going very well for the former. He just hoped that they wouldn't be too late, and so their brisk walk turned into a jog. She'll come, Balthus muttered between labored breaths. Right, boss. He caught one last glimpse of the laboratory as he looked back over his shoulder, catching just a hint of her red hair before it vanished into the shadows. Truthfully, he did not know how to answer Balthus's question. There was no predicting what Happy was going to do. The only thing left to do was hope that she would come to her senses, and Yuri Leclerc of all people knew exactly how dangerous hope could be. Check the description for the links to the author.